Chapter 1 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristin G. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 1. The World and the Flesh. A beautiful woman is intended to create a heaven on earth, and she has no business wasting herself making imaginary excursions into any future paradise. The present is her time for action, and again, Charlotte, I ask you to name the day upon which you intend to marry me," said Nickols Powers, as he stood lounging in the broad window of Aunt Clara's music room, and gazing down into the subdued traffic of Upper Madison Avenue. "I wish you had never taken me across that ferry and into that room crowded with redolent humanity to hear an absurd little man string together vivid, gross words about religion, words that made me tingle all over," I answered, as I threw my cloak on a chair, lifted my hat from my head, and sat down on the seat before the dark old piano. "I think religion is the most awful thing in the world, and I am as afraid of it as I am of death. I'm going home to my father."
"Oh, don't be afraid of it. Religion is the most potent form of intoxication known to the human race. That's why I took you over to hear the little baseball player. I wanted you to get a sip. But don't let it go to your head," and Nickols mocked me with a soft tenderness in his smile.
"Well, it frightened me, and I don't like it. I'm going home to my father, and forget it," I reiterated with a kind of numbness upon me, the like of which I have never before experienced.
"I'll protect you from any religious danger just as effectively as Judge Powers. I'm younger, slightly, than he, but I know just as many of the wiles of the world and the flesh as he does, and maybe a few more," Nickols assured me, with a flash in his dark eyes that was both wicked and humorous, as well as very delightful.
"And the devil, too! But you don't understand. I must go home to my father," I answered still again.
"You don't understand yourself," returned Nickols. "There are strange hieroglyphics imprinted on every woman's heart, and a man can read only an unconnected word here and there when he can get his flashlight thrown into the depths, if he dares adventure into her life at all. I feel that I take my own life in my hands when I allow you to talk to me as I am allowing you tonight."
"How do you know that those hieroglyphics might not mean the salvation of the world if she could spell them out herself, or some great and good person took a steady lamp and went down into her heart and—"
"It takes a very wicked man to read a woman. Good men are blinded by them and stumble," Nickols assured me as he came over, stood beside me and ran his long, slender, artist's fingers up and down the keys of the piano, which evoke a strange, diabolical sort of harmony from them. "I understand about it all, so please come tell me you'll marry me." This time his arms almost encircled me, but I slipped between them as he laughed at me with his adorable pagan charm.
"No, Nickols, that would be an easy and delightful way out, but I am really frightened down in some queer part of my anatomy that lies between my breastbone and my spinal column. Something is stirring in my heart, and I'm afraid of it. I've got to get out in the wilderness and fight with it."
"Take it out on me," offered Nickols, with a laugh that was both wistful and provoking.
"No, I've got a home panic, and I must go."
"Then when do I get my answer from what is left of you after the battle?"
"I'll let you know when to come and get it, under the roof of the Poplars," I answered him from the doorway. And the very next morning I went down into the Harpeth Valley, driven I knew not by what, nor to what. I only knew that I felt full of a living, smothering flame, and I was sure that it was best to let it burst forth in my ancestral abiding place. I was born of a man who was the most evolved brain in the Harpeth Valley, who has been a drunkard for 20 years, and of a very beautiful and haughty woman, whose own mother, to the day of her death, shouted at Methodist love feasts.
It is any wonder that when I was tried by fire I burned, as the cracklings of thorns under a pot. How could you set that ridiculous little Methodist meeting-house on the very doorstep of my garden, father? I demanded, as I stood tall and furious before him in the breakfast-room on the morning after my return home from my winter in the East with Aunt Clara. Cousin Nicholas has spent many months out of 3 years on the plans of restoration for that garden, and he is coming down soon to sketch and photograph it to use in some of his commissions. What will you say to him when he finds that the vista he kept open for the line of Paradise Ridge has been cut off by that pile of stones to house the singing of psalms? And as I raged, I had a feeling of being relentlessly pursued by something I didn't understand. "Madam," returned father, with a dignity he always used with me when he encountered one of my rages, "you will find that the chapel does not in any way interfere with Nichol's carefully planned view. Gregory Goodloe spent many days of thought in seeking to place it so that it would not intrude itself upon your garden, and he built his parsonage completely out of view, though it gives him only one large southern window to his study and only northern ones to his bedroom." "Does the creature also sleep and eat and have his being right there behind my hollyhocks?" I demanded, and my rage began to merge into actual grief, which in turn threatened to come to the surface in hot tears. "Now, Charlotte, my daughter," father was beginning to say with soothing in his voice instead of belligerence that from my youth up had always just preceded my floods of tears. Dabney, the shrivelled black butler, who had always devotedly sympathized with my exhibitions of temperament, to which he had, from my infancy, given the name of tantrums, set a platter of fried chicken before father's place at the damask and silver-spread old table by the window, through which the morning sun was shining genially. Then, with a smile as broad and genial as that of the sun, he drew out my chair from behind the ancestral silver coffee-urn, which was puffing out clouds of fragrant steam. "Breakfast is served, honey child," he crooned soothingly, "and your mamma done put the liver wing right egg in your fork." Dabney had many times stemmed my floods with choice food, and was trying his favorite method of pacification. I faltered and wavered at the temptation. I was hungry. "Just wait until you see Goodloe, and talk it over with him," father says, as he seized the advantage of my wavering and seated himself opposite me as Dabney pushed in my chair and whisked the cover off the silver sugar bowl, and presented one of his old willow-ware cups for father's 2 lumps and a dash of cream. I asked him to "See him? You don't expect me to discuss Nichols and my garden with an ignorant bucolic Methodist minister who probably doesn't know a honeysuckle from a Jimson weed, do you?" I asked with actual rage rising again above the tears as I literally dashed the cream into his cup and deluged the boiling coffee down upon it so that a scalding splatter peppered my hand. "I never want to see or hear or speak to or about him. I'll build a trellis as high as his church, run evergreen honeysuckle on it, and go my way in an opposite direction from his. I'll—" Just here I observed consternation spread over Dabney's black face, then communicate itself to father's distressed countenance as he glanced out the window. Quickly he pushed his morning julep behind the jar of roses in the center of the table, while Dabney flung a napkin over the silver pitcher with frost on its side and mint nodding over its brim. And then, as I was about to pour my own coffee and launch forth on another tirade on the subject of my neighbor, I heard a rich tenor voice singing just outside the window in the garden, beside the steps that led down from the long windows in the dining room to the old flagstone walk. Nichols and I had searched through volumes of dusty antique prints to see just how we wanted that walk to lead out to the sunken garden beyond the tall old poplars. I also saw the handle of a rake or hoe in action across the window landscape, and heard unmistakable sounds of vigorous gardening. I rose to my feet with battle in my eyes, and then stopped perfectly still and listened. Unwillingly, but compelled. Drink to me only with thine eyes, and I will pledge with mine, were the words that floated in at the window on the fragrant morning sunbeams, in a voice of the most penetrating tenderness I had ever felt break against my heartstrings. He sometimes demolishes, sir, a few weeds, father faltered, while Dabney ducked his cotton-wool old head and slipped out of the door. You allow him to work in my garden, and I faltered, just recovering from the impact of the words of my favorite song of songs hurled at me by the unseen enemy, when I was interrupted by his appearance in the open door, and we stood facing each other. I am a woman who has very decided taste about the biological man. I know just how I want the creatures to look, and I haven't much interest in one that isn't at least of the type of my preferred kind. Because I am very tall and broad and deep-bosomed and vivid and high-colored, and have strong white teeth that crunch up about as much food in the 24 hours as most field hands consume, and altogether I am very much like one of the most vigorous of Sorolla's painting. That is the probable pathological reason I have always preferred an evolved whistler masculine nocturne that retreats to the limits of my comprehension, and then beckons me to follow. All other men I have grouped beyond the border of my feminine nature, and sought to waste no thought upon them. It was a shock to come, suddenly, in my own breakfast-room, face to face with a type of man I have never before met. The enemy was astonishingly large and lithe, and distinctly resembled one of the big gold-colored lions that live in the wilds of the Harpeth Mountains out beyond Paradise Ridge. His head, with its tawny thatch that ought to have waved majestically, but which was sleek and decorous to the point of worldliness, was poised on his neck and shoulders, with a singularly strong line that showed through a silk soft collar, held together by an exquisitely worldly amethyst silk scarf, which, it was a shock to see, matched glints from eyes back under his heavy gold brows with what appeared to be extreme sophistication. After the shock of the tie, the loose grey London worsted coat and trousers made only a passing impression, and from my involuntary summary of the whole surprising man, which had taken less than an instant, my dazed brain came back and was held and concentrated by the beauty of the smile that flooded out over me in welcome after my father's hurried introduction. "The Reverend Mr. Gregory Goodloe, my daughter Charlotte," father announced, as he rose and waved in my direction a hand that was cordial to the point of bravado. "I'm so glad you came in time to see your crocuses and anemones, Miss Powers," the Jaguar said as he took my hand in his. "Dabney has let me help him hand-weed them, and they are a glory, aren't they?" While he spoke he still held my hand, and I was still too dazed to regain possession of it. Father saved the situation. Sit down, parson, and let Charlotte give you a cup of coffee while it is on the simmer," he urged, with hasty hospitality, as if intent upon effectively bottling me up, at least for the immediate present. "She was just pouring my cup. Will you say grace before I take my first sip?" was the high explosive he further proceeded to hurl in my face. And as he spoke I sank dumbly into my chair and helplessly bowed my head to a ceremony so obsolete in the world from which I had come that I felt as if I was slipping back into the days of the pioneer, when the customs of life were still primitive and dictated by emotion rather than mental science. And there, with father's concealed mint julep right against his interlaced fingers, the mountain lion bowed his crested head and involved me in prayer for the first time since chapel service in my college days. "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, for which we give thanks, thy children with Lord Jesus. Amen." "Amen," mumbled father, as if from the depths of embarrassment, and against my will, as it were, a queer sort of croon of an echo came from my own throat. Also that was the first time I had ever heard words of prayer under the roof of the Poplars. It embarrassed me and I hated it and the cause of it. The spell which had possessed me since the entrance of the Reverend Goodloe vanished, and the rage that had been in me at the discovery of the intrusion of his chapel and himself upon my life when I had come home to be free to be wicked, boiled up within me and then sugared down to a rich and dangerous syrup. While I poured his coffee I again took stock of him, this time coldly and with deadly intent. The reasons for his entry into my hitherto satisfactory family life, even at breakfast time, I did not know, any more than I knew the reason for the chapel on the other side of the hollyhocks, but I felt that I feared both and intended to get rid of them. If the enemy had been what one could reasonably expect a young Methodist preacher to be, I would have routed him and his meekness within the hour, and had the chapel moved to a lot on a side street in town within the week. However, when a hunter comes suddenly upon a Harpeth jaguar, he is glad to use his best repeater, and he is careful how he shoots, though, if he is very skillful, he may tease the lion aloft with a few nipping shots. I felt suddenly very strong for the fight that I knew was on, though the lion didn't possess that knowledge as yet. Deliberately I fired a preliminary bullet that seemed to graze father, though it left the parson unharmed. "Will you have your mint julep before I pour your coffee, Mr. Goodloe?" I asked, with seemingly careless friendliness. "Dabney, put fresh ice in father's glass, and fill mine and Mr. Goodloe's." "I was feeling a little under the weather this morning," said father hastily, as he set his glass from behind the rose jar upon Dabney's waiter, and motioned it all away from him, thus denying the morning friend of his lifetime. I had never drunk a julep before breakfast in my life, only tasted around the frosty edges of father's, but I held my ground, and held out my glass to Dabney, who falteringly, almost in terror, took the frosted silver pitcher from the sideboard and poured me an unusually large draught of the family beverage. "Will you have yours now, Mr. Goodloe?" I asked again, with still more of the sugared solicitation. "No, I believe I prefer the coffee. But don't pour it until you have drunk your julep. You know frost is a thing that soon passes," was the cheerful answer, though a suspicion of an amethyst glint made me know that the jaguar had at least heard the sip of the bullet. I loathed that mixture of ice and sugar and mint and whiskey, but I had to drink it, and it heated me up inside, both physically and mentally, and took away all the queer dogging fear. And because of it I don't remember what else happened at that breakfast, except that I wanted to clutch and cling to the warm, strong hand that I again found mine in at the time of parting. But I didn't, at least, I don't think I did. After it was taken away from me I went very slowly up to my room, and again went to bed, Mammy carelessly officiating and rejoicing that I was going to nap the steam cars outen my bones. I fell asleep with the continued strains of "Drink to me only" in my ears, and wondering if I ought to put it down as insult added to injury, and I woke several hours later to find Leticia Cockrell, one of the dear friends whom many generations had bestowed upon me, sitting on the foot of my bed consuming the last of the box of marrons with which Nicholls had provisioned my journey down from New York. I was glad I had tucked the note that came in the box under the pillow the night before. I trust Leticia, and she is entirely sophisticated, but she has never had a lover, who lives in Greenwich Village, New York, America. "Is this the open season for 2-day hangovers in New York?" she demanded as she sniffed me suspiciously at the same time she dimpled and smiled at me. "No, this is not a metropolitan hangover. It was acquired at breakfast, Leticia," I answered her as I sat up and stretched out my bare arms to give her a good shake and a hug. "You may shatter the glass if you will, but the scent of the julep will hang round you still," I misquoted, as I drew my knees up into my embrace and took the last remaining marron. "Why, Mammy said Mr. Goodloe had breakfast with you. Did you sneak it from the judge's pitcher?" demanded Leticia, as she likewise drew her knees up into her arms and settled herself against one of the posts on my bed, for the many hours' resume of our individual existence in which we always indulged upon being reunited after separation. "I did not," I answered. "I drank it before his eyes, and then I don't remember what happened, and I don't care." "What?" "Just that. I never have been drunk because I never could drink enough. I've always felt that there isn't enough liquid in the world to face me, and I don't like it anyway, but Dabney was so impressed by his worship that he poured it double for me before I had breakfast. I hope I staggered or swore, but I don't think I did. The Reverend Goodloe can tell you better than I. Ask him." "Gregory Goodloe? Oh, Charlotte!" "That's the point I was coming to, Letitia. Just who is this Reverend Goodloe that I shouldn't drink a quart of mint julep before him if I want to? I had well over a pint of champagne with a Mr. Justice 2 nights before I left New York, and I stopped then out of courtesy to one of the generals whom we expect to defend us from the Kaiser. Who is your Gregory Goodloe? Tell me all about him, unexpurgated and unafraid." "Didn't you know about him? And the chapel before you came?" Letitia inquired cautiously, as if fearing the explosion she felt was sure to result. "I did not," I answered. "I met him and his chapel and the mint julep all in the same 5 minutes, and is it any wonder I went down? Go on, tell me the worst of the best. I'm ready." And as I spoke, I settled my pillows comfortably, getting a little thrill from the crumpled letter underneath the bottom one. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Kristin G. in Oslo, Norway. The 13th of January, 2012. Chapter 2 of The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristin G. The Harpeth Jaguar.
"It is beautifully romantic, but I don't know what we are going to do about it," answered Letitia with genuine trouble, puckering her brow under one of her smooth waves of seal brown hair. Letitia is one of the wonderful variety of women who patch out life, piece by piece, in a beautiful symmetrical pattern, and who do not have imagination enough to admire anything about a righteous crazy quilt. She is in love with Clifton Gray, has been since she wound her brown braids about her head, and is piercing strips of him into her life fabric by the very sanest love, courtship, marriage design. "We just can't go on as we have been doing lately," she continued. "We all decided that you would know what to do about him, and would do it when you came home. We suspected Judge Powers hadn't written you all the facts when you didn't come, and the building went on up. You will be able to do something about him, won't you?"
"I think it is likely," I answered, with the brittle sugar in my voice that Letitia only half knows the flavor of. "But don't try to sketch things, Letitia. Begin at the beginning and go straight to the end. I'll pick up the pieces." "Well, of course you remember the Bishop Goodloe romance, don't you?" asked Letitia, hopeful that she could get a small start ahead on her chronicle. "I don't remember anything about any bishop ever. I forget things about that kind of people. What did or didn't he do?"
"Charlotte!"
remonstrated Letitia.
"He was the last of the Goodloes who built that old Goodloe home on exactly the place where the first Goodloe set stakes of the first stockade put up in the Harpeth Valley, right here in Goodloets. It burned down the night he married that Miss Gregory in New York, before we were born. Don't you remember we used to play in the ruins, just over here beyond the garden where the chapel stands now? Your father bought the property. Part of your garden is old Madam Goodloe's garden, and that's why it was so wonderful for Judge Powers to give the lot and let Mr. Goodloe build the chapel there. We all felt that, though some of us were scared when we thought about what you might do when you came home. Still, after we saw what wonderful little stone chapel that Mr. Goodloe had one of the greatest architects in New York design, after he had sent him packages of sketches of your garden and the poplars, so it would only make it all the more beautiful, we felt better. You don't really mind about it, do you, dear?"
Letitia's voice was beseechingly enthusiastic, though keyed down with a note of anxiety. "Go on," I commanded, packing down the rage in the dark corners of my inmost heart.
Nobody ever knew why Bishop Goodloe never came back after he married, while on a mission from the Southern Methodist Conference to the Northern Methodist Conference. He severed his relations with his own conference, and he never preached again, though he was one of the most wonderful and eloquent preachers the South has ever known. He was the youngest bishop the church had ever ordained. Nobody ever knew what happened, and all we know now is that this perfectly beautiful man, who is the bishop's son, came down to the General Conference in Nashville, was examined and ordained, and the presiding bishop sent him out here to Goodloe's last November. We don't know anything about him, except that he has been fighting in the trenches in France for a year and has had a bullet cut out of his left lung. Everybody adores him, and we all sit spellbound listening to him preach, I think mostly on account of his voice, because none of us ever seems to remember what he is preaching about. He's been having services in the ballroom at the country club, but he's going to dedicate the chapel soon, and we are all relieved. It has been fun to go out to church at the club twice every Sunday, and to prayer meeting on Wednesday night all winter, and we've danced in the long parlor at home and in double parlors at Jessie's Litton's, so as not to disarrange the the chairs, in the ballroom. But now that the spring has come, we need the club. I'm glad you will be here for the dedication, and you will help us kind of
taper off your religious spree? I asked with a laugh that Leticia echoed shamefacedly.
That's an awful way to put it, but
true.
We've all tried hard, but it is such a bore. It doesn't seem fair to enjoy Gregory Goodloe so much at dinners and parties, and not show our respect and admiration by being good church members. Jessie joined his study workers, and she took a class of the awful little children from down in the settlement beyond the phosphate mills, who all smell terribly. She worked hard with them twice a week for a month, and then Mother Spurlock, who is the front pillar of his congregation, found that she had taught all the dirty little things to sew with their left hands. She came in one morning and found them all stitching away industriously backwards, just because Jessie is left-handed herself. Mother Elise laughed until she lost her breath, and Mr. Goodloe had to help unloosen her belt for her. The meeting broke up with ice cream on Jessie for everybody. We all belong to home mission societies and sewing circles and
You want me to get you out of your purgatory and let you backslide to
Don't say it,
exclaimed Leticia with a laugh.
But we just want not to hurt his feelings, and
we won't, I said grimly. Now let's talk about the ball out of the club we are going to give Nichols when he comes down the 1st of May.
That's just what I mean. I knew you'd understand, and I'm so relieved that you're not angry about the chapel and things. We can leave it all to you, and we'll have the times of our lives. Billy Harvey says his ankles are getting stiff. It's been so long since he has foxtrotted. Do call Mammy and Sally, and let's look at your clothes.
With which Leticia descended from her spiritual heights into the realm of the material and plunged with both Mammy and Sally into a riot of clothes. For an hour or two I lay back in my pillows and watched the 2 black women and the white one indulge in primitive decorative orgies, and from their delight my eyes would glance out and fix themselves wistfully on the dim line of Paradise Ridge which was cut by the square steeple of weathered stone just where Old Harpeth humps itself up above the rest of the ridge. And something sore and angry and trapped hurt under my breast. "The earth is the Lord's," chanted itself in my mind to the tune of "Drink to Me Only," and my hand curled around the letter under my pillow as if for comfort and defense. "It is just as you told me that night at the piano, Nichols dear. Religion is the most potent form of intoxication known to the human race. And apparently all my friends have been getting the drink habit badly. I'll rescue the poor dears and have an interesting time doing it," I said to myself, after Leticia had departed with my most choice millinery creation fastened down upon her sleek braids because she found she could not live without it.
And then a strange thing happened, as I lay prone between the lavender-scented sheets spread on the four-poster bed of my foremothers, ready to drift off into another bone-resting nap. The flood of tears that had risen from my heart when I had sat that night a week ago and listened to that remarkable little baseball evangelist, the tide of which had been rolled back when Nichols had bent his beautiful dark head against mine in Aunt Clara's music-room and whispered above the roar of New York. Religion is the most potent form of intoxication, to me, again welled from my heart, and this time flooded my lashes and my cheek and my pillow. What was strangest of all, they seemed to wash away all the tears of anger and fear that I had been pressing back into my depths from breakfast time, and left me weak and again ready for sleep. And like a comforted little child, I slept. It was sunset when I awoke, and I felt as strong as two women and ready for action, the call for which was upon me by the time Sally had put me into her favorite creation, selected from the ones she had hung in closets and wardrobe. "Mr. Bill Harvey and Mr. Hampton Dibrell is down on the front porch, ready to gallivant you, honey bunch, and I see Miss Letitia and her Mr. Cliff Gray coming in one direction, and Miss Jessie in another, so I reckon Sally has better hurry with that New York twilight she's fixing on you," Mammy announced as she stood in the doorway and beamed upon me. "And I expect the parson will be stepping over likewise for a few words, seeing you are so sweet, and showed such pretty manners to him this morning," she added with reverent delight. "Sweet? Showed such pretty manners?" I gasped, as Sally fastened the last hook and eye and stood beside Mammy to admire me. "'Twas no more than you ought to done to the preacher, and I was proud of my raising of you when you held on to him and begged him to stay to dinner. I was so disappointed that he had to leave us. I am a colored Methodist, I am, and if I do say it, I know how to shake a young pullet in the skillet for a preacher's taste, black or white. Now go on down and stop that buzzing for you on the front porch. Sally, come and carry out the tea and cakes to the guests." With which command to both of us, Mammy rolled her 250 pounds down the hall with great majesty, while Sally meekly followed in her wake. "Sweet? Showed such pretty manners?" I quoted to myself as I slowly descended the steps and went out on the wide porch to find my friends assembled under the budding rose vine that wreathed the tall white pillars of the poplars. The parson was not there. "Rescued!" exclaimed Billy, as he grasped one of my hands and hung on with a very good imitation of a drowning man seizing a lifeline. They all laughed, and Hampton Dibrell held my other hand as ardently, though not in quite such light vein. I had to rescue it, to accept Clifton Gray's nosegay of huge violets from his greenhouse, and I embraced Jessie with a nosegay pressed to her pink cheeks. "Oh, Charlotte, I could foxtrot with you a week and not hesitate," exclaimed Billy, still clinging to me. "Let's begin tonight," I assented warmly. Billy is contagious, and to dance with him is a high art. "Let's motor out to the club in Hamp's car and mine, have a chicken supper and a dance until sunup," suggested Billy. "We can stop by and get Mark Morgan and Nell, and I believe Harriet Henderson will come along, if everybody asks her. All the men, I mean," Letitia added with enthusiasm to match Billy's. Harriet Henderson is the latest emerged widow in Goodloets, and consequently is most interesting to the masculine world at present. "Let's start now, so as to give the chicken plenty of time to get into the frying pan and over the fire," said Hampton, who is always the practical member to bring up the details of any situation. "I'm just from the tennis courts, and I'll have to stop to dress, I'm afraid," said Letitia meekly, as if she felt sure of a storm of remonstrance. "People don't dress to dance these days, Letitia," said Billy, with the greatest innocence of mien and expression, a manner he always used in speaking to Letitia's rather illiterate directness, and in which he delights greatly. "They undress. You are unclothed enough as to ankles, and if you roll the sleeves of your tennis shirt to your shoulders, take off your collar and tuck in the flaps, it will be enough to satisfy our cravings for fashionable and suitable attire. We really want fried chicken rather than chicken." "That will do, Billy," Letitia answered him with gentle firmness. "That was just what I remarked, Letitia dear.
That will do, for we want chicken dressed with creamy gravy, and don't care about any swathed in chiffon. And furthermore—" "Do hush, Billy. Look who's coming," Jessie interrupted him, and there before my eyes I saw my entire group of friends begin to preen themselves into new beings. Leticia smoothed down her skirts a fraction of an inch, rolled down her sleeves another fraction, and pushed back into her braids a brown lock that was rioting across her brow. Jessie shook out her muslin ruffles, reefed a fold of net higher across her neck, and pinned it in place with a jeweled pin, while Hampton's and Billy's and Cliff's expression and poses of countenance and bodies suddenly fell into lines of decorum. "Great smokes! We all forgot it was prayer meeting to-night, and it'll be no trotting the fox for ours," Billy groaned, while he rose to his feet, with a smile of angelic sweetness. "Hello, parson! We were just beginning to think about you," was his greeting to the sacred jaguar, who had come through the garden and around the house. I felt sure that he had heard Billy's plaint of disappointment about the dance, for there was a quick glint of the amethyst as he halted and stood on the walk below us and smiled up at us. "I welcomed Miss Powers for breakfast, and now I find I want to come over and do it again for tea," he said, and as I was perfectly cool, sober, and in my right mind at the moment he spoke, I had to concede that his voice was the most wonderful I had ever heard, and something in me made me resent it as well as the curious veneer that had spread over my friends at his entry upon the scene. There they stood and sat, 6 perfectly rational, fairly moral, representative, free, and equal citizens, cowed by the representative of something that they neither understood nor cared about, and it made me furious. They all wanted to go to the club to dance, to do the natural, usual, perfectly harmless thing, and they were being constrained. If they had wanted to go to the prayer meeting as they wanted to dance, they would have been natural and joyful and eager about it. Even I resent people's being bored with the God they think exists, and I think it is disrespectful to go into his presence like that, I said to myself, and then I suddenly determined to begin my rescue work for the religiously involved, and now I felt was the appointed time. Also I felt the excitement that comes from turning and facing the foe which has pursued. "I am glad you came over, Mr. Goodloe," I said with a nice, cool friendliness in my voice. "Billy was just planning a glorious foxtrot for this evening, and then suddenly remembered with dismay that you were to have your entertainment at the club tonight. Couldn't we make some sort of compromise? Or at least couldn't you cut your prayers short so that we can get in an hour or two of his favorite pleasure after duty well done?" As I spoke I had come to the edge of the steps and thus stood alone above him, looking down on him with a kind of cool aloofness as if he belonged to another world, while I heard all of his recent converts grouped back of me give little gasps of dismay. End of chapter 2. Read by Kristin G. in Oslo, Norway. The 24th of January, 2012. Chapter 3 of The Heart's Kingdom by Marie Thompson Davies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristin G. The Heart's Kingdom by Marie Thompson Davies. Chapter 3. The Gauntlet. Was that young Methodist minister crushed by my plainly intended gauntlet flung down to him? He was not. "I am glad I came over in time to put Billy out of his misery," he answered, smiling up at me with a quick comprehension that was enraging. "I am going to have informal services in the chapel tonight to try out the acoustics before the contractor turns over the building. I am not satisfied about the sounding board he has put in, and the only way is to try it with at least part of the seats occupied. We'll sing a bit and plan the dedication, not have a formal service. So then, Billy, you can have your foxtrotting and a good time to all of you. Bless you, my children." As he spoke he smiled at the entire group with most delightful interest and pleasure. He was dressed in a straight black coat, with a plain silk vest cut around a white collar that buttoned in the back, and his dull gold mane was brushed down sleek and close to his beautiful head. Not a flash of expression in his strong face showed that he felt any resentment or dismay at thus having some of his most prominent church members backslide from his prayer meeting into a foxtrot, and yet I knew that he fully appreciated the situation and laid the blame of it where the blame was due.
"Of course we will come to the services first. That is, if you don't object,"
Leticia said with her usual directness and lack of any kind of finesse, thus bringing the situation to a decided head. "Why not come over for the songs and then not stay for the conference?" was the genial answer that positively astonished me, and as he spoke he came up the steps and stood beside me. "Dabney and I found the first star of Bethlehem when we were reading this afternoon. I brought it to you carefully, and can I have a cup of that tea he has been trying to make you serve for the last 5 minutes?" With these words the Reverend Mr. Goodloe turned me around and sent me to the tea tray that Dabney and Sally had put on a table under the rose wine, but not before he had taken up my hand, put the star-flower in it, and curled my fingers over it. "I'll pass the muffins, Billy, and you take the cakes for Miss Powers, and be more careful than you were last Sunday with my collection plate for the poor." Billy feigned confusion, accepted the plate, and was just about to begin a defense, when a diversion occurred to stop him. "There comes Mark and Mrs. Mark," he exclaimed, "but they have got an offspring apiece in their embrace and several trailers. Somebody ought to remonstrate with Nell Morgan, or have the firmness to apply the superfluous blind kitten treatment every spring. 3 children are patriotic, but 5 are populistic, and ought to be frowned upon." And Billy grumbled all the while the Morgans were flocking up the front walk. When they came to the steps the Jaguar descended, and held out his clerical befrocked arms, so that the gurgler from Mark's shoulder and the giggling from Nell's arms both fell into his embrace at one time. "You young marplots, you," he said, as the gurgler printed a wet kiss on his left ear and regarded him with rapture, while the small cooer, proclaimed as feminine by neck and sleeve ribbons, cuddled against his shoulder with soft confidence. "They're going to take you both down to the river and drown you," he confided, with a soft note in his voice that was an answer to the coo. "I wish you would," said Mark, as, with a laugh, he shook my hand extended from the group around me, composed of Nell and the other 3 kiddies, all crowded together in one passionate greeting. "Nurse and Julia and the house and garden man have all gone to a wedding, so we have fed them and are now starting out for a razoo, and we don't care whether it lasts until midnight or not. Young Charlotte, you hug one side of your Aunt Charlotte and let Jimmy get his innings on the other side. Here, break away, all of you." And while everybody laughed, Mark disentangled the greetings and seated the separate juvenile members in a row on the steps beside the parson and the 2 babes. Nell he left in the hollow of my arm.
"Oh, it's so good to have you at home, Charlotte," she said, with another hug. "We miss you terribly. We depend on you for everything. Things don't go right without you. I had a terrible time with... That is, you haven't seen baby yet. Give her to me, Mr. Goodloe."
And as she spoke, Nell leaned over to get the cooer out of the Jaguar's arms for my inspection. "You'll get neither babe nor suckling," was his answer as he cuddled the 2 closer and hunched his shoulders in Nell's direction. "Don't you know enough to let well enough alone? If they have got to go out to club and foxtrot until midnight, they ought to have repose now."
"We promised to be good at church, but we didn't promise anything about the country club, and if we go there, we are going to be as bad as anybody out there is," announced small Charlotte with determined composure. "Dabney says that foxtrotting is a devil's dance, and we want to see you all do it with him."
"Help!" exclaimed Billy, while Mr. Goodloe put his arms around Charlotte and drew her to him with a kind of fierce tenderness.
"Isn't she awful?" exclaimed Nell. "We meant to ask you if we could take them with us out to the club to prayer meeting. Some of the settlement women bring their babies, and I know mine will be as good. Charlotte and Sue and Jimmy promised, and the sound of your voice bewitches the babies as it does all of us."
As Nell finished speaking and bent to pat the head of the suckling on his shoulder, the Reverend Mr. Goodloe looked straight into my eyes and laughed, perfect comprehension of me and my revolt in his direct, amethyst glances which shot into my depth. "They are all going over to listen to Mr. Goodloe sing hymns at his chapel, Nell, and then all of you are coming by here for me to go out to the club to dance a few hours," was my answer to the shot as I calmly refused the invitation into the fold that had been given me with the rest of the backsliding flock. "We can't go. The babies would never in the world," Nell was beginning to exclaim. "Drat 'em!" exclaimed Billy, looking down aggrievedly at the small crew of marplots. "A pair of perfectly good chaperons are hard to get, and to think of that bunch of little miseries getting in the way of a good old fox." "They'll all go to sleep during the services, and I'll keep them on my bed in the parsonage until the fun is over, and agree to deliver them on claim," Mr. Goodloe interrupted Billy to say with quiet decision. "Now that is what I call some church relation, nursery and parsonage combined," said Billy with the deepest gratitude. "The rest of you hurry over those muffins, even if you haven't had any of Mammy's for 6 months, and, since the chicken fryer is off, go home to get suppers and ready for psalm singing and foxing. Parson, you are some sport, and I'll hold both of those puppies while you drink your tea from the hands of fair Charlotte." "Thank you. I don't believe I want any tea after all, and I think I'll take these puppies on home with me through the garden, for they are both dying to the world." As he spoke, the parson rose to his feet, and stood with the 2 drowsing babies in his arms, looking down at me as I stood with his cup of tea in my hand. And as he looked I felt my whole rebellious heart and mind laid bare, and I knew that he knew that I was ready to fight him to the last ditch in the battle for possession of the souls of my friends. I would fight for their independence of thought and sincerity of life, and he would fight to lead them off into a far country in quest of what I considered a tradition, a shibboleth, a potent agent for intoxication of the reason by which man must progress. I also knew that I faced a foe versed in the warfare between religion and modern scientific decisions about it, and that he would be one worthy of my mettle. His refusal of my cup of tea, for which he had announced that he came, was his gauntlet, and I accepted it, as I turned with a queer sugared rage in my heart and set the cup on the table. And as I had planned, and the Jaguar directed, the evening came to pass. While I slipped into some dancing fluff, the strains of the most wonderful hymn that the Christian religion possesses floated across my garden and into my window and again beat against my heart. The parson was singing with the rest of them, but his voice seemed to lift theirs and bear them aloft on the strong, wide wings that went soaring away into the night, even up to the bright stars that gleamed beyond the tips of the old grey-beard poplars. A queer tight breath gripped my heart for a second as his plea, "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide," beat against it, then I laughed it away. It is a potent agent for intoxication when brewed by the Reverend Mr. Goodloe, and here's where I run, both physically and mentally, I said to myself as I ran down the steps and out to the 2 cars that stood honking impatiently by the gate. I don't think I ever enjoyed a dance more, and I am sure that my pleasure was partly due to the wild spirits of the religiously released who were having the first joy fling for 6 months. "I'll not get enough until I wilt upon the floor and have to be carried out," said Billy, as he held me closer and slid 2 steps to the right and then back to get me out of the way of Hampton and Harriet Henderson, who were dancing with regardless joy. "Will you feel that way about church next Sunday?" I asked him, but my demand made no apparent dent, for he danced on without answering. At an hour after that of midnight, the revellers came home and left me at my gate, by request, to walk alone in the brilliant spring moonlight through my garden to the wide door back of the white pillars. After they had seen me safely started, they glided away, and I stood on the steps and watched Nell and Mark reclaim their family from a tall dark figure that carried out 2 loads to the parental arms. Then the hush that comes upon the world in the midnight hours fell over the poplars, and I stood leaning against one of the tall pillars and revelled in it. Goodloets is one of the tradition-gravy old towns that are rooted deep in the Harpeth Valley, since the days of the colonies, and in it can be found perhaps the purest Americanism on the American continent. The poplars, under whose broad roof I made the seventh generation nested and fledged, spreads out its wings and gables upon a low hill, which is the first swell of the Harpeth Hills, and the rest of the old town stretches out on the hillside before it, down to the valley, in which runs the Harpeth River, curving around the town, and flowing out of the valley to the Mississippi. Behind the poplars roll the fields and meadows of the home farm, which has given food and sustenance to the poplar's brood since the days of the Redskins, when it was cleared by the first Powers and his servants, with musketeers ready to fire into the surrounding forests. To the left of the poplars and beyond the chapel lies the settlement, in which those lacking in worldly goods have lived for generations in a kind of semi-poverty, which is about the only poverty known in the Harpeth Valley. Lately the settlement has taken unto itself a measure of prosperity, because of the great tannery and harness works in its midst on the banks of the river, which is bringing in gold from Russia and France. Everybody has made money in the last few years, and the fashionable wing of Goodloets, to the left of the poplars, shows improvements and restorations that are both costly and sometimes amazing. However, fortunately the inhabitants of the old village are conservative, and very little of the delicious moss of tradition has been scratched off. It has only been clipped into prosperous decorum, and antiquity still flings its glamour over the town. I feel as much rooted as one of the old poplars, I said to myself as some whim made me go down the steps and out into the garden, along the walks with their budding borders of narcissus and peonies, down through Nichol's sunken garden to the two oldest of all the poplars that now seemed to be standing sentinel to prevent any raid from me on the little stone meeting house over the lilac hedge. "You dear old greybeard," I said to one on my left, as I looked up and saw a faint feathering of silver on its branches. And as I spoke I took the old trunk into my embrace and laid my cheek against the rough bark. And then something happened. Afterwards I was glad that I was leaning against the strength of the old greybeard poplar and hidden behind it. Suddenly from out the shadows, beyond the lilac hedge, through whose bare branches any movement in the yard of the chapel showed plainly, a woman came stumbling along towards the gate, and beside her walked the parson with his arm supporting hers. She was sobbing the hard, dry sobs that any woman knows are those of despair, and which call any other woman who hears them. My first impulse was to run to the hedge and speak to her, then I stopped, for I was arrested by what the parson was saying to her. "What does it matter, Martha? You have your master's forgiveness, and his permission to go and sin no more, even though those sins be as scarlet." And as he spoke his voice was that of quiet authority, as if he felt fully his apostolic right to unloose sins upon this earth. "He'll come back now, and that she has, and he'll come to me again. I can't fight him. I'll slip back into hell. Just give me the money to go out into the city, and I'll not bother anybody any more. I'll take the child, and I'll die for all anybody in Goodloets ever knows. Lend me the money. I'll send it back." The girl's voice was hard and defiant, and she turned and faced the minister as if at bay. "Give me that money, if all that praying and singing and preaching that you've done is true. I want to go in the morning before he follows her here and puts me in hell again. God won't clean me twice." "You shall go," came the calm answer in the apostle's beautiful voice, "but I will have to have a few days to provide a place of safety for you in the city, where the child can be cared for while you get suitable work." "I won't wait. He'll follow her, and he'll look down on me and the child and damn me again. I won't wait. I'm weak, and I dasn't. Give me that money. Tonight." And the demand was passionate and savage. "Then I'll meet you at the morning train with it and rush you to a place of safety, if there is no other way. You must go back home now, and it will be best not to tell anyone where you are going until you no longer fear your weakness, for they might betray your hiding place. Strength will be given you, Martha, if you only ask."
I'll pray, parson, I'll pray, now that you are going to give me a chance to get strong enough to be good. I'll work and I'll pray, but hide me until I do get strong." And the hard, dry sobs melted as the girl put her head down upon the gate a moment and then went out through it. "God bless you, child, and keep you ever in the thought of Him," were the words that she carried away with her as she hurried down the street toward the settlement. Then for a second some awful fear came across my heart that I did not understand. I know now that it was a premonition of what was to wring my own heart, and I cowered against the old tree in agony. Gregory Goodloe was not more than 6 feet away from me on the other side of the budding, fragrant hedge, and in the moonlight I could see the beautiful strength of his golden head and strong, placid face, on which lines of pain were drawn, and I had to restrain myself from crying out to him in my own pain. I wanted to go quickly and cling to his strength. Then I stopped and listened. He had raised his face to the stars and was praying. "Oh, Father," he asked, as if speaking to someone with whom he walked in the cool of the midnight, "help the weak on whom the strong prey." Then he went into the dark door of the little chapel and left me out in the cold midnight alone. The fear was gone, and comforted I went back through my budding garden and arrived at the front door just as old Mr. Pate, the telegraph operator at the little station down the street, turned in at the gate. "Miss Charlotte," he puffed, as he fairly flung the telegram at me, "this come for you at 10 o'clock, and I risked it and run up here with her after I heard them automobiles go by. I'm courting Mrs. Jenny Hicks myself, and I understand about courtings." And before I could speak he had run on back down the street. As I stood and looked at the yellow envelope, fear again gripped my heart, and without opening it I walked into the house, locking the great door behind me with trembling fingers, and went toward a light I saw shining from the trellised back porch, and which I did not understand. I have never in my life been the least bit afraid of anything, except something within my own body, from the hideous pain of my green apple days to the pain I had felt as I talked beside the piano with Nichols in New York, 1,000 miles away. But something made me pause just for a second in the pantry doorway before I stepped into the light upon the porch. I shall never forget the scene that was enacted before my wondering eyes in the dim light of a candle burning upon a table near the refrigerator. Father stood with a bowl of ice in his hand, and his fingers were just closing around the squat, black bottle that I knew contained the rarest and choicest whiskey ever run from a distillery. His iron-gray hair was rampant, his dressing-gown fell away from his throat and showed the knotting of the great cords that ran down into his shoulders, and his dark eyes glittered under their heavy black brows, while his mouth was twisted and white. Then, as I looked, something happened. A stealthy padding of feet came around the house from the garden and up the back steps, under the budding rose vine that was climbing through the trellis, as if to clutch at the light, and a huge figure loomed up from out of the shadow. It was the powerful Harpeth jaguar out hunting, and his weapon was a hoe, while under his arm he carried a roll that looked like a contribution to a ragman of bedding and old clothes. "I tell you, Mr. Powers, there is frost in the air, and I have collected everything in the parsonage that would cover those late anemones. I saw your light, and I thought you might add to the collection. Now what would we do if they should be wilted by the frost just as they are ready to burst bud? Our honor is involved with Graveson, who brought the seeds all the way from Guernsey through the trenches of France, and trusted them to me for propagation. Why, they represent a man's life work, and that life may be put out by a bullet any moment. We'll have to rescue them." As he spoke, the great jeweled eyes shone with excitement under the dull gold brows, and he seemed not to see at all the incriminating ice and bottle. "Could you get into Mrs. Dabney's linen closet? We've got to have something." He shivered in a little wind that blew under the rose vine with a frosty gust. I was just observing that he was attired in his pyjama jacket and grey flannel trousers, and that his bare heels and ankles declared themselves above and at the back of his slippers, when his eyes were drawn to my father's face and rested there. My heart stood still while I watched it change. All the pain and appetite,
straining as a beast strains at a leash, faded from his face. The deathly pallor vanished, and the colour of human blood returned. The glitter in his deep old eyes changed in a second from that of ferocity to that of anxious excitement. "I do not know where the household linen is kept, and I hesitate to disturb Dabney, as he retired with an aching tooth. But I observed a box of my daughter's apparel beside a trunk in the back hall, which Dabney had not carried up on account of its weight, and which he was requiring his wife to unpack piece by piece. I'll raid it for enough to save our treasures and accept whatever is my just chastisement in the morning," he said in a voice of guilty stealth. And there I stood in the shadow of the pantry and saw my father take 2 armfuls of my costly linen and lace out into the garden. Nothing was spared me, for from the window I could see him and the marauding jaguar weight their perfumed whiteness down with sticks and stones and clods of earth. I suffered, but silently. "Good night, sir. God's blessing," I heard the rich voice calling, as the half-bare feet padded away as swiftly as they had come through the garden, leaving father standing under the rose-vine watching him go. And I watched father, and for some reason my breath seemed suspended in my lungs. For a very long minute he stood looking at the ice bowl and the bottle. Then, with a queer wry smile, he walked over and put them both in the refrigerator, though the bottle's place was in the sideboard, and closed the door carefully. Then he paused again and said under his breath, "You, Judge Nicholas Morris Powers." He smiled at himself with a humorous pity, and tiptoed past me into the front hall, and up the stairway to his room above. I seemed to feel strange, padding footsteps down in my depths, and I also tiptoed up to my room after I heard his door shut. After I had switched on my light, for under the roof of the Poplars electricity had come to aid the candles of hallowed tradition, and was called by Mammy, in deep suspicion, "hand light," I discovered, clutched in my cold fingers, the yellow envelope the romantic Mr. Pate had brought to me in the midnight. It read, "Am coming down on Friday. Am afraid to trust the world and the flesh and think the third member of the carnal firm ought to be on the job. N." Now I am frightened, really, I confided to myself as I slipped between the scented sheets and drew a corner of the rose-colored blanket over my head. I don't know what to do. End of chapter 3. Recording by Kristin G. in Oslo, Norway. The 22nd of July, 2012. Chapter 4 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristin G. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davis. Chapter 4. To Turkey Gulch. The next morning I was very late in descending to my breakfast, but arrived in time to witness Mammy's arraignment of my father, which was conducted in perfect respect, but with great severity. "I know, Judge, that menfolk don't know lace that costs $1,000,000 a yard from a blind woman's tatting, and that's what makes me say what I does, that it sure am dangerous for 'em to go on a rampage in womenfolk's trunks. I ain't never going to git the stains from them clods of earth out in my lamb's clothes, even if the minister did help you put 'em on 'em." "But, Melissa, those anemones were more valuable than any lace ever manufactured, and I am sure that Charlotte will absolve me when she hear of the exigencies of the case," father pleaded over the top of his morning paper. Mammy was pretending to dust his study, as a blind to the lecture she was administering. "Yes, sir, I knows all that, but that lace was a heap more valuable than that toothache in that wuthless Dabney's jaw, which he could ha' wropped up, and hunted out all the old sheets for you instead of that petticoat with them real lace ruffles," was Mammy's firm rejoinder, while she passed a feather duster over the table and rolled her eyes at Dabney. "Let 'em both off this time, Mammy. Dabney can take the trunks where they belong and lock them up. I said, as I went toward the dining room, while she followed to minister upon my tardiness. "Them was all your finest lingerings," she said as she plied me with breakfast. "And they was all lost on men folks. They hasn't even one lady rode by while I had 'em on the line in the sunshine," she grumbled as she finally retired to the kitchen. After finishing my coffee I sauntered to the front of the house, led by a chorus of hearty laughter in a fluty tenor voice, accompanied by a bass growl, in which I was sure that father was recounting the scrape in which his and the Reverend Mr. Goodloe's anemone adventure had got them. I assured myself that I was annoyed by this repeated early morning invasion of ministerial calls, and intended to retire to my room until it was over, but without knowing why, I found myself in the library and greeting the enemy. "Please forgive us. The case was one of dire necessity," the Reverend Mr. Goodloe pleaded, as he rose and took my hand in his, and held it in such a way that I was forced to look in his face and smile, whether I wished it or not. "From ambush I saw you take them, and I was powerless to prevent," I answered with a smile at father. "I came out to ask you if you wouldn't like to go away out in the Harpeth Hills on a mission with me this wonderful morning. I don't know exactly whether I am called to officiate at a birth or a death or that intermediate festivity, a wedding. This is the summons from an old friend of mine." As he spoke, he held out to me a greasy paper on which were a few words scrawled with a pencil. "Parson, we need you in the morning bad. Please come with Bill as brings this. Bring a Bible and liniment and oblige your true friend, Jed Bangs and wife." "Isn't your friend Bill able to elucidate?" I asked, as I passed the paper on to father. "Bill seems to be dumb without being deaf, and has no histrionic talent to act out the necessity, so I'm going with him. The Banks family live up on Old Harpeth at Turkey Gulch, and Jed has shot partridges with me all winter. Please, you and the judge, come with me. I can get the car over Paradise Ridge if I turn it into a wildcat. The morning is delicious, and I feel that I'll need you both." Never in the world have I heard a man's voice with such compelling notes in it that ranged from a soft coax to a quiet command. I had not the slightest idea of going with him, and I was about to refuse with as much sugary hauteur as I dared use to him, when I looked into father's face and accepted. I had never been on a picnic with my father in my life, and I could not understand the pleading in his eyes for my acceptance of this invitation to an adventure in his company, but then, several times since I had come home, I had seen a father I had never known before, and he fascinated me. "The mountain laurel is in bloom, and the rhododendron, and you are a very gracious lady," the Reverend Mr. Goodloe assured me with a deep bow over my hand, which he kissed in a very delightful foreign fashion, which made Mammy, who had come to the door to hear my decision, roll her eyes in astonishment, which, however, held no hint of criticism, for with her the spiritual king could do no wrong. "I got a snack fixed up just as soon as that Dabney told me about the jungle," she announced. "And I'll put a little wine jelly and flannels in, if it am a baby, and a bunch of white jessamines, in case it am a death." "Suppose it is a wedding?" I asked her. "I don't take no notice of weddings. It was a wedding that got me into all the trouble of that Dabney and his worthless son, Jefferson, what ain't like me in no way." With which fling at Dabney, who was hovering at the door, she rolled herself back to her kitchen. "What have you been doing to her now, you rascal?" father demanded of Dabney, who was handing him his hat, and holding out his light overcoat to put him into it. "I just stepped into the kitchen while the light rolls for supper was racing, and got the rockers for it," was his mild answer. Dabney lived his connubial life mildly in the midst of the storms of his better half. "Well, don't do it again. And put that spade in Mr. Goodloe's car, for I'm going to bring in some honeysuckle roots and a laurel sprout or two to try out in the garden," father commanded, as I took my coat and hat from the chair where I had thrown them the afternoon before. and went out to the very unministerial-looking car which stood before the parsonage. Of course, I had accepted the Reverend Mr. Goodloe's invitation for the journey out into the hills in order to sit beside this very new kind of father I was dimly discovering myself to possess, but I do not to this day know how it happened that I was crushed against the arm steering the grey racer as we sped through Goodloets toward Old Harpeth, while the judge sat beaming, though silent, beside the more silent Bill, who did not beam, but looked out at the road ahead with a shadow in his face of the fatalism that so many of the mountain folk possess. We were just turning out from the edge of the town, past the last house with its stately white pillars, when a bunch of pink and white precipitated itself directly in front of the car, which made the first of the wildcat springs that its master had prophesied for it, and then stood with its engine palpitating with what seemed like mechanical fear, while I buried my head on the strong arm next to me, which I could feel tremble for an instant, as the Reverend Mr. Goodloe breathed a fervent "Thank God." Father rose from his seat with a good round oath, and Silent Bill snorted like a wild animal. "Why didn't you stop when you saw me coming?" an imperious young voice demanded in tones of distinct anger, and Charlotte, my name daughter of the house of Morgan, calmly climbed up on the running board over the door next to father and settled herself in between him and the Silent Bill. "Now you can go on," she calmly announced in a very much mollified tone of voice as she shook out her ruffles into a less compressed state and wiped her face with her dirty hand, much to the detriment of the roses in her cheeks. "Where are you going, Charlotte, may I inquire?" asked the Reverend Mr. Goodloe in a cheerful and calm voice, though I saw that his fingers still trembled on the steering wheel as he held back the enraged grey engine. I was still speechless, and I saw that father was in the same condition. "You said I might go next time when my Auntie Harriet didn't want me to go with you last Tuesday on account of my stomach from the raw potato Jimmy dared me to eat. This is that time," she calmly answered, as she gave an interested look at the Silent Bill, and again settled the short pink skirts. "Yes, I did say that," admitted Mr. Goodloe as he turned in his seat as far as he could and began to argue the question. "But we shall be gone almost all day, and I am afraid your mother wouldn't want you to be gone that long." "Is it true for you to say that when you know that she will be mighty glad for you to keep me safe with you all day?" Charlotte demanded of him, looking directly into his smiling friendly face. "No, that wasn't quite honest, I'll admit," he answered her gravely with the guilt of conviction showing in his face just as plainly as it would have shown if one of his deacons had caught him evading a question of grave moment. "And as it is the fulfillment of a promise which you claim, I am going to ask Miss Powers and the judge if they will permit me to add you to the party, and then go and get permission from your mother to take you with us." "My mother told me to go and bother Auntie Charlotte an hour or two, and that was when I met you. I ran into the car just minding my mother," Charlotte answered him with calm pride at her near achievement of death through literal obedience. "Just drive by, and we'll call to Nell. I'm afraid the case must have been desperate, for I am seldom the victim," I said in an undertone to our host, who acquiesced with a laugh. "Harriet Henderson must be dead, for Nell usually sends the worst one to her," I added under my breath. "My Auntie Harriet is having a man cut the ache out of one of her teeth," Charlotte remarked, apropos of nothing, as the huge car swung around into the street in which the Morgans reside. "And besides, I don't like her any more, because, when she said Sue had to have part of the doll house she bought for us to play in down at her house, and I said then Sue would have to take the outside because I wanted the inside, she locked it up for all this week." "The modern business acumen of the feministic persuasion," father remarked, as we all laughed at this candid revelation of an egocentric attitude of mind in small Charlotte. After a few whirls of the grey wheels we paused a moment at the Morgan gate. "Heavens, yes, and thank you!" called Nell in response to our demand for her small daughter's company. "If I had another one clean I'd give it to you." "Better go on quick,
for Jimmy can wash in a piece of a minute if he wants to," warned Charlotte, and in a second the parson had sent the grey car flying out toward Old Harpeth, though I saw him glance back with a trace of distress in his eyes at the fading vision of a small boy running, howling, to the front gate of the Morgan residence. "Now mother'll whip him for crying if she does as she says she would, but she won't," observed the tender big sister, as she rose to her feet and waved a maddening farewell to the distressed urchin being left behind. "Is she totally depraved?" I asked of the young Charlotte's spiritual adviser at my side. "No, perfectly honest," he answered me with a glint in his eyes that was a laughing challenge. "There is something awful about honesty," I answered, without appearing to notice the glint. "There wouldn't be if it were a universal custom," was the answer I got, as we whirled by a farmer's wood lot and began to climb the first foothill of Old Harpeth. All my life I have been going out to Old Harpeth in excursion, but never had I spent a day like the one I had begun with the jaguar in his native fastnesses. The whole old mountain was beginning to bud, and I could almost see it draping on a regal Persian garment of rose and green threaded with purple and blue woven against the old brown and grey of the earth color. The wine-colored trillium with its huge spotted leaves, the slender white dog-tooth violets, the rose-pink arbutus, the blue star myrtle, and the crimson oak buds, were matted into a vast robe that was gorgeously oriental, while a perfume that was surely more delicious than any ever wafted from the gardens of Arabia floated past us in gusts through which the grey car sped without the slightest shortness of breath. I seemed a million miles away from the great fetid city in which I had been living, and fast going farther. As we wound up and up into the great forest, which is the crown of Old Harpeth, we could look down through occasional vistas and see the Harpeth River curling and bending through pastures in which the chocolate powder fields were laid off in huge checks with the green meadows, while the farmhouses and barns dotted the valley like the crude figures on a hand-woven chintz. There are very few men who know enough not to talk to a woman when she has no desire for their conversation, but the Reverend Jaguar seemed to be one of the variety who comprehend the value of silence, and neither of us spoke for at least 10 miles, though, of course, it was his duty to make hay while the sun of my nature shone upon him and delicately to inquire into my spiritual condition. He didn't. He just let the wind blow into my empty spaces, and kept his eyes and thoughts on the road ahead of him. Charlotte's chatter with father was blown back from me, and I was happy in a kind of aloneliness I had never felt before. We are in Hastings County now, and in a few minutes we shall be in Hicks Center, the county seat, were the first words that broke in on my self-communion as we began to sped past rough board and log cabins, each surrounded by a picket fence which in no way seemed to fend the doorsteps from razor-back pigs, chickens, and a few young mules and calves. It must be court day, for I don't see a single inhabitant sitting chewing under his own wine and fig tree. Yes, it's the first Monday, answered father, as the grey machine pulled gallantly through a few hundred feet of thick, black mud and turned from the wilderness into the public square of the metropolis of Hicks Center. Yes, court is in session, and there the whole population is in the courthouse, said father, as we glided slowly down the village street. They must be trying a murder or a horse-stealing case. And I saw his eyes gleam for a second under their heavy brows, as the eyes of an old war-horse must gleam when he scents powder. Ugh, assented Silent Bill, making the first remark of the journey, and as he spoke the syllable, he rose and pointed to the courthouse, which stood in the midst of a mud-covered public square, completely surrounded by hitching posts, to which were hitched all the vehicles of locomotion of the last century down to the present in Hicks Center, which had not as yet arrived as far as the day of the motor car. "Is Jed there, Bill?" demanded the Reverend Mr. Goodloe, and as Bill ascended with muscular vigor, if not vocal, He drew the grey car up beside an old-fashioned carryall, whose wheels were at least 5 feet high, and which had hitched to its pole an old horse and a young mule. "That team makes a nice balance of temperament," Mr. Goodloe remarked, as he lifted out Charlotte and then turned to swing me, in his strong arms, free of a mud puddle and onto the old brick pavement which was green with the moss of generations. Then, piloted by the silent Bill, we made our way through a quiet throng of men and women and children, from the awkward age of shoe-top trousers and skirts to that which, in many cases, was partaking from the maternal fount, as the women stood in groups and whispered as they looked at us shyly. Somehow their decorous calico skirts, which just cleared the ground, made me feel naked in my own of white corduroy, which was all of 8 inches from the mud in which theirs had draggled. And as silent as they, even Charlotte's chatter subdued, we entered the courtroom and were led through a crowd up to the front seat. At least the rest of us were seated, but the judge, jury, and prisoner and prosecuting attorney rose in a body and shook hands with the Reverend Mr. Goodloe as if he were their common and best beloved son. "He's been in the Harpeth Valley less than a year, and look at that. We've been here all our lives, and they don't know who we are," whispered father, with the same pride shining in his eyes that shone upon the parson from the eyes of the gaunt prisoner, who rose and shook hands with Mr. Goodloe with the sheriff beside him, while the rough old judge from the bench waited his turn. "We accommodated Jed by waiting until you come before we began his trial, parson," the judge said, as he turned back to his bench, which was a splint-bottomed chair behind a rude table, dignity being lent to the chair by its being the only one in the room. The rest of the population of the courtroom of Hicks Center were seated upon benches made of split and hewn logs. "Thank you, Mr. Hildrop," said the Reverend Mr. Goodloe, as he sat down beside the prisoner and began a whispered conversation with him. "The court have come to order. Shoot ahead, Jim, and tell us what Jed have done and how we done it," commanded the judge, as he tilted back his chair, took out his knife, and began to whittle a stick of bright red cedar. 12 good men and true, attired in butternut trousers stuffed into muddy boots, settled themselves in the jury box, which was a log bench set at right angles to the other benches, a little apart from the table and chair of the judge, and 9 of them took out their knives and bits of cedar and began to follow the lead of the judge in making fine pink curls fall upon the floor. "May it please your honor, the prisoner is charged with the stealing of a young mule," said a lanky young mountain lawyer, who had put on a coat over his flannel shirt and brushed a little path of tow hair just above his brows in deference to his position as prosecuting attorney. "State your case," commanded the judge, as he tried the point of his splinter against his thumb to test its whittled sharpness. "Hiram Turner over at Sycamore lent Jed a team of mules to haul his daughter, who married Jed, home in a wagon with her beds and truck, and when he come down Paradise Ridge to get them team, Jed claimed one had got away from him and run off in the big woods. There was a horse and mule trader come along the same day Jed lost the mule, and when Hi and his boy, Bud, knocked Jed down in a fight they found $50 on him in a wad what he won't say where he got it." With which concise statement the prosecuting attorney sat down and fanned his perspiring brow with his ragged felt hat. "Got anything to say, Jed?" inquired the judge in a friendly and leisurely fashion, after the accused had been duly sworn in by the sheriff. "How come a man like you let a mule get away from him?" With the judge's friendly question there entered another actor on the scene, in the person of a mountain girl who had been cowering on a bench just behind Jed, her face hidden by a black calico split bonnet. "Please let me tell, Jed," she pleaded in a soft whisper that only father and I heard, as we sat just behind her. "No," was the one word he gave her, but it was spoken with a soft little purr in his husky voice. Then he answered the judge with a kind of quiet dignity, which I saw that the 12 booted jurymen listened to with respect. "Judge,"
he said with a stern look into the judge's face. "I reckon you'll have to send me down to the pen. I let that mule get away from me, and I didn't steal or sell him. This is all I got to say." And he sat down. I felt father start at my side, and then sink back onto his bench. "Where did you get the money, Jed?" the judge demanded. "That I ain't a-tellin'," answered Jed determinedly. "Just send me down to the pen, for you'll know all you'll ever know." "Well, Jed," the judge was beginning to say in an argumentative tone of voice, when father arose and stepped in front of the bench. "May it please your honor to appoint a counsel for the defense?" he asked in the ringing voice that brought all the outsiders crowding into the door. I had never heard or seen my father in a courtroom, and I had never suspected him of the resonant silver voice with which he made his demand. "We ain't got a lawyer in Hicks Center but Jim Handy here, and he can't prosecute and defend too. I always kinda looks out for the prisoners myself," answered the judge. "Then may I offer myself to the prisoner to conduct his defense?" father demanded, and they looked over at Jed, who in turn looked at Mr. Goodloe before he nodded. "Then shoot ahead, stranger. Jim have told all there is about it, but you can have he and Bud Turner sworn in and get any more than they got to say. Them men speak truth when they speaks." At which statement every good man and true nodded his head with firm conviction. A gaunt old mountaineer who sat over by the window cleared his throat in an embarrassment that marked him as the Hiram Turner alluded to. "I don't think I shall need the testimony of Mr. Turner or his son," father answered quietly, as he stood tall and straight before the jury. "I want to put Mr. Banks' wife on the witness stand and question her before the jury. Sheriff, call Mrs. Banks." "No, stranger, no," said Jed, and he rose as if to combat, but Mr. Goodloe laid a restraining hand on his arm, and trembling, he took his seat. "Don't tell nothin', honey," he whispered, as the girl rose from her bench, laid aside her cavernous black bonnet and advanced, took the oath administered by the sheriff, and stood facing father. "Now, Mrs. Banks," said father, with silvery tenderness in his voice, which I felt sure had gained him the reputation of never having lost a case in which a woman was involved, "I want you to tell us all that happened on the day that Jed let the mule escape him. Look at me, and tell me all about it." "Well, stranger," began the mountain girl, with a look of confidence coming into her face that was like a little pink, wide open arbutus, "I reckon you won't believe me, like Jed didn't at first, though he do now." "Don't tell, honey," the prisoner commanded and implored in the one plea. "I'd rather take the pen. They won't believe you." "It was this way," she continued, without seeming to hear the command of her young husband, upon whose arm the parson again laid a restraining hand. "Jed he had unhitched the team, and tied them with their rope halters to the fence 'fore our cabin, when it was almost dark 'fore we got there. Then while I was unpacking the wagon, he got on one horse and ride down the side of the gulch to see where water was at. I was just taking the things in, when a man came along, leading 5 mules and riding on one. He was a city stranger in fine clothes, and he asked me for a meal, because he had lost his way from a man who had a tent and a grub. My mammy always cooked for strangers, so—" "She sure do that," ejaculated Mr. Turner, proud of his noted hospitality. "So I made up a fire hastily in the yard, and put on the coffee pot," the girl continued. "I had some corn pone and bacon my mammy had given me for a snack, and I heat that up. Whilst I got the meal, the stranger he went on unloading our wagon, and then he come to a bundle of bed quilts what my mammy had been saving for me from her mammy and her grandmammy. He took a notion to them, and asked me how old they was, and I told him about as old as any 20-inch cedar on Old Harpeth. He asked me to trade 'em, but I couldn't bear to until he had reached to $50, what was the price of a young mule, all on account of his sisters wanting quilts like them up in a big city.
I was kind of crying quiet a letting him go, but I thought about what that mule would be to Jed who was so good to me, so I give him to him and he tied him on his saddle and went away. It war most an hour when Jed come, and when I told him and showed him the money, he didn't believe me about them old quilts, and he took the rope from around the neck of the mule he'd been riding and She paused here in her story, and put her scarlet flower face in her hand, while Jed groaned and dropped his own face down upon his arm. The old judge's face took on a grim sternness, the jury stopped whittling, and the face of every woman in the courtroom gazed upon the girl with stern unbelieving accusation. "Go on now, honey, but they won't believe you," commanded Jed with a sob. "Your husband took the rope from around the neck of the mule and left him untied?" asked father gently. "What for, Melissa?" asked the old judge, without gentleness or any show of confidence in what the shrinking woman was saying. "To beat me with. He was crazed mad, and called me a name, but I don't hold it again him," answered the young wife, with a glance at the cowering prisoner.
"He done right,"
calmly announced one of the 12 good men and true, in which muddy boots and flannel shirt, and every mountain woman in the courtroom nodded her head in approval of the pronouncement.
"Order in the courtroom. You all shut up and listen,"
commanded the judge, as father looked around the room, and then at him with a stern demand for control of the situation.
"Then what happened, Mrs. Banks?"
Father continued to question. "I hollered and fought and scared the mule off into the big woods where he can't be found to keep my husband out of the pen," she answered with a sob. "It took me a week to make him believe about them quilts, and then Poppy come along and fought him about the mule and found the money, as he claimed he sold the mule for what was the quilt money."
"That will do. Thank you, Mrs. Banks," said father, with the same deference and tenderness he had used when he began to question her. "Does the prosecution wish to question the witness?"
"They ain't no use of questioning her when she says a man gave her $50 for 5 old quilts,"
was the answer made by the young prosecuting attorney, who did not rise to his feet to make this remark.
"Please ask Mrs. Banks if the quilts were woven ones of 3 colors, and then call me to the stand," I said to father quickly. He put a question to the weeping young wife, and got an affirmative answer, after which he dismissed her and had the sheriff swear me in.
"Can you throw any light upon the matter of the purchase or sale of these quilts, Miss Powers?"
Father questioned me formally. "If they were all hand-woven, herb-dyed, knitted quilts, they are worth $50 apiece in New York today. I paid that for one not 5 months ago," I said, staring haughtily into the calmly doubting faces of the mountaineers in the jury box and on the benches.
"Do you want to question the witness?"
my father asked the indolent young prosecutor. "Don't know who she is, and don't believe she's telling the truth,"
was the laconic refusal of the prosecutor to let me influence his case.
"Well now, Jim, Parson Goodloe here brought the gal along with him, and I reckon he can character witness for her," interposed the judge. "Sheriff, swear in the parson." His command was duly executed.
"Mr. Goodloe, do you consider Miss Powers a woman who can be depended upon to speak the truth?"
Father asked him formally. "I do." The Reverend Mr. Goodloe answered quietly, and just for a second a gleam from his eyes under their dull gold brows shot across the distance to me, and if it hadn't been all so serious, I should have laughed with glee at his thus having to declare himself about my character in public. But the next moment the situation became much more serious, and my heart positively stopped still as I seemed to see prison doors close upon the young husband.
"Do you want to question the witness?"
father asked of the lolling young prosecutor. "How long have you known the lady, parson?" he asked, with a drawl and one eye half closed. There was an intense silence in the courtroom for almost a minute. Then the Reverend Mr. Gregory Goodloe answered calmly. 3 days. "That might be long enough for a parson, but it ain't for a jury," the young attorney answered, and there was a quizzical kindness in the old judge's face as he smiled at Mr. Goodloe and shook his head. Mr. Goodloe started to speak, but father waved him back to his seat, turned to the judge and jury and began the most wonderful speech on the subject of circumstantial evidence and ethical law that I have ever heard. His beautiful deep voice was as clear as a bell, and 20 years seemed to have fallen from his shoulders. I was looking at and listening to the man he had been before I was born. And when I could tear my eyes from his radiant face, I watched these stolid mountaineers with whom he was working his will with a power they had never experienced before and did not understand. The men in the jury box and the men on the hewn benches dropped their eyes before his flaming ones as he shamed their censorious manhood, and some of the sun-bonneted women bent their heads and sobbed when he arraigned them for the lack of motherhood and sisterhood for the poor young wife who had come over the ridge to live among them. Would you men and women rather believe a girl light of love and faithless, and send your neighbor to prison for 2 years for his young life, when he could mean much to you and his state and his nation, than to give them a little human sympathy and justice? Do you prefer to pin your faith to the value of a worthless, vagrant mule, then? But just here, when Judge Nicholas Morris Powers was winding himself up for one of the greatest appeals to a jury he had ever made, a mule stepped into the case and took away the honor of its winning. He poked his inquisitive nose into a back window of the courtroom which looked out upon the edge of the big woods, and gave the whole assembly a hoo-ha of derision. "Lordy mighty! There are Pete come back himself, with all the curkles in the big woods sticking to him!" exclaimed Hiram Turner, as he rose and went to examine his property. "He wasn't sold to no mule man. Further crops the hair and the hoofs to see if they're healthy 'fore they buys. This here frees Jed." "And now that you gentlemen have the testimony of a mule, will you not believe the word of Mrs. Banks and Miss Powers about the valuable quilts?" my father said, after he had commanded silence by raising his hand. "We sure do believe every word of it, stranger, and you won this here case, and not that mule," a stern old sister in a gingham apron and black bonnet said, with a commanding glance at the jury. "Yes, stranger," answered the hoary old foreman, whom to this day I believe to be the meek husband of the commanding old woman in the black bonnet. "I've done got the mind of the jury, and they all voted for you and not the mule. I hereby give that mule to Jed Banks and my daughter Melissa, and I'll knock off a half on the price of his teammate to Jed if he gives me his forgiveness and hern." Old Hiram rose and turned with his hand on the forelock of the mule hero to say to the assembled courtroom, "Go round and halter him quick, Jed, 'fore he breaks away again, the derned fool," he added in another voice. "Yes, prisoner, you are declared free, and hurry to catch him, for he is straining against Hiram," was the judge's sentence, delivered from the bench as everybody rose and began to stream out to watch the tussle between Jed and the wild mule. Father and the parson were among the first to gain the door. In the next few minutes I found that some of the shy mountain women were beginning to hover about me, and in another 10 minutes I had laid the foundation of an export rug and quilt business that I have a feeling will thrive greatly. "Were you arrested because your mother told you not to sell the quilts?" was Charlotte's sympathetic question to the young Mrs. Banks, and I saw the mite take a clean handkerchief from her small pink pocket and apply it to the tears that were coursing down Melissa's cheeks over the dimples which her smiling mouth was putting in their way. "Just be a good girl, and God will forgive you," she comforted further, nestling a dirty pink cheek, which rubbed off against Melissa's wet one. And I asked if she were totally depraved less than an hour ago. I apologized to my name daughter in my heart. All the way home I sat beside father, and once I laid a timid hand in his, through whose fingers the pride I had in him must have flown into his. He flushed for a second, and then was pale again. "You can't put new wine in old bottles, daughter," he said sadly as he glanced down into the valley. The car was running smoothly, slowly, and noiselessly around a sharp curve, and the Reverend Mr. Goodloe both heard and answered the sad axiom. "The finest wine mellows in casks and is then bottled free of dregs, Judge. I think the wine of life is of that vintage.
he said, with one of his radiant smiles that I could see fairly warm father from his paleness. I wondered just what he meant by the wine of life. I asked myself as I went to say good night to old Harpeth after I put out my light before going to bed. End of chapter 4. Recording by Kristin G. in Oslo, Norway, the 15th of September, 2012.
Chapter 5 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 5. Having It Out. "Well, of course we knew Nickols would follow you, Charlotte, but we did hope to have you all to ourselves for more than just a week," moaned Nell Morgan, as we all sat on the front porch of the Poplars in the warm spring sunlight several mornings after I had told them of Nickols's arrival on Friday, which announcement had come in the midnight telegram. I winced at the words "follow you," and then smiled at the absurdity of the little shudder. "Yes, Nickols will be absorbing, but we can all sit hard on him and perhaps put him in his place," responded Letitia Cockrell, as she drew a fine thread through a ruffle she was making to adorn some part of the person of one of Nell's progeny. "I do not believe in ever allowing a man to take more than his share of a woman's time." "Do you use grocery scales or a pint cup to measure out Cliff Gray's daily portion of yourself, Letitia?" asked Harriet Henderson, with a very sophisticated laugh in which Nell joined with a little giggle. Harriet was appliquing velvet violets on a gray chiffon scarf, and was doing it with the zest of the newly liberated. Roger Henderson had had a lot of money that, in default of a will, the law gave mostly to Harriet, but in life he had not had the joy of seeing her spend it that he might have had if he could have gazed back from placid death. "Do you make the same allowance of affection to him in the light of the moon that you do in the dark?" she further demanded of the serene Letitia. "Well, he doesn't have to see his share divided up into bits and handed out to the other men," was the serene answer to Harriet's jibe, and which was pretty good for Letitia. "My dear child," declaimed Harriet, as she poised a purple violet on the end of her needle, "don't ever, ever make the mistake of letting one of the creatures know just what is coming to him. Isn't that right, Nell?" "Yes, and it is pretty hard to keep them in a state of uncertainty about you when there are 4 certain children between you. But I go over to visit my mother at Hillsboro as often as she'll have the caravan, and plead with Billy Harvey or Hampton Dibrell to keep me out until I'm late for dinner every time they pick me up for a little charitable spin. That and other deceptions have kept Mark Morgan uncertainly happy so far, but if I am pushed to the wall I'll go to the Reverend Mr. Goodloe's study for ministerial counsel, like you did last Friday afternoon, Harriet," was Nell's contribution to the discussion, which she delivered over the head of the suckling on her breast. "Now how did you get hold of that choice bit of scandal, Nellie?" asked Harriet, with serene interest, as she bit off a tag of purple silk thread from the stem of one of her violets. "Billy Harvey says that scandal is a yellow pup that dogs a parson's heels, to which everybody throws some kind of bone," remarked Jessie. Jessie always vigorously represses Billy in his own presence, and then quotes him eternally when he is absent. Mother Spurlock had come over from the settlement to see him about the state of the treasury of the Mothers' Aid class, and she stopped in to get a bundle of clothes I had for her," Nell answered Harriet's question. "She said she didn't mind the hour lost if the parson could give a wee bit of comfort to your wrestling soul. I didn't like to tell her that I thought it might be Mr. Goodloe who was wrestling for life and liberty, for you and I have been friends since we could toddle, Harriet, but it was temptation to share my anxiety with her." and serenely Nelly patted the back of the drowsing suckling. "Wrong this time, Nell," answered Harriet, as she placed still another violet. "I was doing the wrestling, but I went to the mat. I gave up $25 and took the directorship of that Mother's Aid. Never having been a mother, I pointed out to him that I was not exactly qualified, but he laid stress upon my energy and business acumen, and I gave up. I mentioned you for the honor, but those marvelous eyes of his glowed with some sort of inner warmth, and he said that you had all you could do and would need help from me just as the women at the settlement do. I'm going to present your Susan with a frock out of that linen and real Valenciennes I bought in the city last week for a blouse for my own self, and I'm going to give the making to that little Burns woman, who sews so beautifully and cheaply to support her 7 offspring, while Mr. Burns supports the Last Chance Saloon down at the end of the road. In that way I'll be aiding 2 of Mr. Goodloe's flock at the same time. And when I told him my decision, he laughed and said, 'Be sure and have it made 2 inches shorter than you made Sue's frocks, because her bare knees ought not to be hid from the world.' That was about all that transpired in the whole hour of spiritual conference you are spreading the scandal about, and you ought to be ashamed." Suddenly something in me made me determine to have it out with those 4 women and see what results I could get. I felt thirsty for knowledge of the well-springs of other people's lives. "Harriet," I demanded, "just why did you join Mr. Goodloe's church?" "Let's see," answered Harriet, as she poised a violet and gave herself up to introspection. "Mr. Goodloe?" I asked squarely, and my honesty drew its spark from hers. "Mostly," she answered briefly, "and I believe in the church as an institution," she added, with honest justice to herself. "I think it is absolutely horrid of you to ask a question like that, Charlotte," said Nell, as she turned the fretting suckling over on her knee and began another series of pats. "We all of us went to church and Sunday school when we were children. Up to the time I left, not a single one of you had ever gone to church with any kind of regularity, and not a one of you had ever supported its institutions. I've been here less than a week, and each one of you has in some way shown me how bored you are with the relation. That's all the case I have against your or any church, just that the members are bored. Also, do any of you get any help in your daily lives, aside from the emotional pleasure it is to you to hear your minister sing twice a week, which would be as great or greater if he sang love and waltz songs from light opera for you?" And as I asked my question, I looked quickly from one to the other of the 4 women seated with me under the roof of the Poplars, and tried to search out what was in their hearts. I knew them and their lives with the cruel completeness it is given to friends to know each other in small towns like Goodloets, and I could probe with a certain touch. And as they all sat silent with me, each one driven to self-question by my demand, I threw the flash of a searchlight into each of them. These are some of the things that stood out in the illumination. Harriet Henderson has always been in love with Mark Morgan, since her shoe-top dress days, and she married Roger Henderson because Mark was as poor as she before the Phosphate Company gave him his managership. Nell and the babies are the nails driven in her heart every day, and she loves them all passionately. She is only 28, and life will be long for her. She needs help to live it. Whence will the help come? Nell married Mark when she was 18, and has produced a result every year and a half since. She loves him mildly, and he loves her after a fashion, but her endurance is wearing thin. His mother had 7 children, and he thinks that an ideal number, though she was one generation nearer the pioneer woman, and also had a nurse trained in slavery who was a wizard with children. Mark wants to have a lot of joy of life, and so far he drags poor exhausted Nell with him. It is a question how long she can stand the social pace and the overproduction. What is going to help her when she breaks down? How will she hold him faithful while she rears and trains all the kiddies? Where will she get spirit to love him and work out their salvation? Also, Harriet is always there. Something will have to help Nell. What? Billy loves Nell and doesn't know it. He loved her before she was married. The children make him rage superficially and burn inwardly. He gambles and drinks, but is honest and adorable. What is going to make a real man of him? Jessie Litton's mother died in a private sanitarium for the mentally unbalanced, and she knows all about it. She loves Hampton Dibrell and never looks in his direction or is a moment alone with him. He is in the unattached state of ease where any woman can get him if she cares to try, and Jessie has to keep her hands behind her. Leticia is serenely happy, with not a dark corner that I know of. She loves Cliff Gray and always will. Cliff is faithful and as good as gold, but he will hang around Jessie, who encourages him, because she is lonely and considers him safely tied up with Leticia. Mr. Cockrell is the best lawyer in town, and Mrs. Cockrell the most devoted wife and mother. I can only feel that Leticia Cockrell needs a jolt, and I don't see where it is coming from. And I am lonely, and I feel that the constant anxiety about father is more than I can bear, worse now when I realize what he has been and could be, and that I love him. He is the hardest drinker in Goodloets, and yet never is drunk. He is soaked from the beginning of one day to another. He began to drink like that the day my mother died, and I have always known that I was helpless to help him. The weakness was in him, only supported by her strength so long as she was there. He was the most brilliant mind in the state, and was one of the supreme judges when mother died. Now Mr. Cockrell manages his business for him, and I have lately come to know that I must sit by and watch him disintegrate. I cannot endure it now, as I have been doing. What is going to help me in this? Shame for him? I have gone away to my mother's people to forget, and left him to Dabney, and I've come home to begin the suffering all over. I'll never leave him again. What's going to help me? And there is something deeper, a race, something that fairly eats the heart out of my pride. On almost every page of the history of the Harpeth Valley, the name of Powers occurs. One Powers man has been governor of the state, and there have been 2 United States congressmen and a senator of our house. Father is the last of the line. Because race instinct is the strongest in women, I am the one who suffers as I see my family die out. What is going to help me? A few gospel hymns in a tenor voice, the like of which I should have to pay at least $3 to hear in the Metropolitan. The scene on the porch rose in my mind, but I felt that I both doubted and feared such succor. And I am in still deeper depths. Nickols is the son of father's first cousin, and has father's full name, Nickols Morris Powers, and he is the last of his branch of the house. Father loves him and is proud of him, and nothing ever enters his mind except that I will marry Nickols and start the family all over again. And this is the tragedy. I love Nickols and am entirely unsatisfied with him. He is the Whistler nocturne that my Sorolla nature demands, and he eternally makes me hold out my hand to grasp nothing. He stands just beyond. I am unable to decide whether he does or does not love me. In New York he lives his life among the artists and fashionable people with whom his highly successful profession throws him, and I don't see why he cares to come back here where he was born and reared, in pursuit of a woman like me. I am as elemental as a shock of wheat back on one of father's meadows, and Nickols is completely evolved. He laughs at race pride and resents mine. For 6 months I had been in New York, living with Aunt Clara in Uncle Jonathan Van Eyck's old house down on Gramercy, just to go into Nickols's life with him. I went about in the white lights of both Murray Hill and Greenwich Village for about 185 evenings, and then I fled back to my garden and the poplars, and my anxiety. I thought I had come home to be free, and I found the same old chains. And then had come Nickols's telegram of pursuit in the midnight after I had stood by in the shadow and watched a strong man pray and a weak man battle with himself. I was frightened at the future and what was going to help me. I don't actually understand a word of Gregory Goodloe's sermons, really understand them, I mean, but it helps me to see that somebody truly believes that there is something somewhere that will straighten out tangles in life as well as thread. Harriet broke in on my still hunt into my own and other people's inner shrines as she snapped a bit of tangled purple silk thread, knotted it, and began all over again on the violet. I don't care what he preaches about. He's soothing, and I need a little repose in my life after—oh, what is the matter now?" And as she finished speaking, Nell Morgan arose and went with the suckling asquirm in her arms to meet the large noise that was arriving down the front walk. The delegation was headed by young Charlotte, whose blue eyes flamed across a very tip-tilted nose that bespoke mischief. Jimmy stolidly brought up the rear, with small Sue clinging loyally to his dirty little Paddy, which she only let go to run and bury her corn-silk top-knot in Harriet's outspread arms, where she was engulfed into safety until only the most delicious dimpled pink knees protruded above dusty white socks and equally dusty white canvas sandals. Though within a few months of 4, Sue had discovered Harriet and never failed to take advantage of her. "What is the matter?" again demanded Nell, as the vocal cords of Charlotte ceased reverberating and her countenance resumed a more normal color and expression. "A rock flew and the minister's window got broked." Charlotte gave forth this announcement with the diplomacy that might have been admirable exerted in a juster cause. "Who had the rock?" demanded the mother sternly. "Jimmy," was the decided answer, given with a threatening glance at the son of the house of Morgan, who quailed in his socks and sandals and began an attempt to screw one of his toes under one of the flagstones of the walk. I knew in an instant that the rock had never left the hand of small James, but the clash of Nell's wits with young Charlotte is so constant that at times the maternal ones are dulled. The accused must have physically scented my sympathy, for he lifted large, scared, pleading eyes to mine for a brief second and then dropped them again. I went to the rescue. "Sue, who broke the window?" I asked, as I extricated the 4-year-old witness from Harriet's chiffon and violets. I doubted if young Susan had attained the years of prevarication as yet. I was right. "Tarley," was the positive answer. "Boom, book, cook," was the graphic description of the crash she added, as she squirmed back among the violets and the needles and the thread. "Charlotte!" exclaimed Nell in real despair. "Jimmy did have the rock in his pocket, and he just lent it to me to throw at a bird right above the window. It was a nice round one, and he brought it from home to see if he could kill anything. It most killed the minister, and the rock is a little bluggy. Isn't it, Jimmy? He's got it in his pocket for keeps." "Yes," answered young James, with the brevity with which he usually made responses to the loquacity of his sister. "Do you mean that you hit Mr. Goodloe as well as broke the window?" demanded Nell, in still more horror, as she came down 2 of the front steps. "He didn't mind," answered Charlotte. "He liked it, because he made us both learn a verse of a hymn to sing for punish, and Sue can sing it too. Come on, Sue." And before any of us could recover from our horror at the violence the young parson had suffered at the hands of the marauders, Charlotte had lined the other 2 up on either hand and begun her exhibition of the benefit arising from the throwing of the rock. It was a good example of the good that may result from evil, which is one of the puzzling reverses of one of the Christian tenets. "Work, for the night is coming, work through the morning hours, work while the dew is sparkling, work 'mid springing flowers," trilled Charlotte in a high, buzzy young voice, while Jimmy piped in a few notes lower. Baby Sue's little clear jumble of words in perfect tune was so bewitchingly sweet that Harriet again engulfed her, while the outraged mother, not so easily beguiled, sailed down the steps and around through the garden toward the chapel, driving the 2 older offenders before her to the scene of the crime. Who is going to help Nell train up liars and murderers into good citizens? I asked myself in my depths, and I joined with the others in the admiring laugh at young Charlotte's dramatic powers. "Mr. Goodloe is the most wonderful thing I ever saw with kiddies," said Jessie Litton, as she rose to her feet to begin leave-taking. "Yes, I must go, for father expects me to luncheon," she added, at my remonstrance. "I'm going to kidnap Sue while I can, and I may never bring her back. I must fly," said Harriet, and she departed hastily to the small roadster she had parked beside the gate. "Come on, Letitia, and let me take you home," she called over her shoulder, and Letitia followed to secure the short spin around the corner to the old Cockrell home, which was set back from the street behind a tall hedge of waxy-leaved Cherokee roses. Thus, almost in the twinkling of an eye, I was left alone, which state, however, did not last more than a few seconds, for around the corner of the house from the chapel, from which direction the whole world seemed to be going or coming, arrived Mrs. Elsie Spurlock, beaming the welcome to me that had always found a ready response. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marian Spiegel. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 6. Deep Digging. In another twinkling of eyes, both of mine and hers, I had taken her bundle from her, seated her in the largest rocking chair, and she had untied her bonnet strings, which denoted that she had come for a genuine visit. "Well, dearie, dearie me, the sight of you is good for tired eyes, Charlotte," she bumbled in her rich, deep old voice. As she spoke she tucked a white wisp of curl back into place beneath the second water wave that protruded from under the little white widow's ruche in her bonnet, and continued to beam at me. I met Nellie Morgan and her Anarungans hurrying to pray a pardon from Mr. Goodloe for that rock which might have killed him, if thrown an inch to the right, instead of only nicking that yellow head of his, the Lord be praised. Was that the same Lord doing when he let the rock fly from Charlotte's hand to within an inch of the Reverend Mr. Goodloe's life, Mother Spurlock? I asked her, with the old warfare over the same old subject rising at the very first minute of our meeting. I have wondered sometimes in the last few years if the wrestling with me over her faith was not ordained for the purpose of strengthening Mother Spurlock's power of patient argument. She is the only person in the world to whom I speak from the depths, and the relief of her sweetened and seasoned wisdom is the straw at which I often clutch to save myself. I surmise that he guided the hand of that child so that the verse of the hymn and the chastisement of the rod I hope Nellie will inflict might work together for her good. All of us must at times let a little blood for another's good, heart's blood, very often, not just that from our scalps and shins. And as she answered me without a moment's hesitation, she enveloped me in loving question. "Are you always going to occupy the anxious seat in front of the Lord, child? Still, sit as long as you like and go on questioning him. You'll find the answer." "The whole town seems to have gone into your fold and left me on the anxious seat alone," I answered, as I drew my chair nearer to her and took her lined, strong old hand in mine. "That Billy Harvey passes the collection plate up the aisle on Sunday, and plays poker all Saturday night till Sunday morning, down at the Last Chance, in a room in front of the one in which poor Pat Burns, who carries a hod for his money, loses his all. Mary Burns sews all day and half the night to feed him and the children, but she puts her pittance into Billy's plate every Sunday, and I know that she gets the strength to go on from day to day from the words that come from the same pulpit he sets the plate behind. That is, we call the table out at your country club a pulpit, until we get our own in the chapel from which to praise the Lord. So you see that there are some sheep who have a taint of goat hair in the wool still left. I won't say with you, out in the world. And speaking of that world, have you come back to say good-bye to us?" "I don't know yet, Mother Spurlock," I answered candidly. "I ran away from that world, but it is coming after me on Friday." You'll be sent into the vineyard where you are most needed, and there you'll serve," she said, with a faraway look coming into her eyes as she let her glances roam out to the dim hills of Paradise Ridge. A flood of love and reverence rose in my heart for her as I sat quiet and let her spirit roam. Mother Spurlock had been the gayest young matron in Goodloets, living in the great old Spurlock home, with handsome, rollicking young George Spurlock for a husband, and 3 babies around her knees, and in one short year she had been left with only 1 large and 3 tiny graves out in the placid home of the dead, beyond the river bend. The babies had been taken by that relentless child foe, diphtheria, and young George, reckless with grief, had let a half-broken horse break his neck. The young woman, aged by her grief, had sold the great house to the next of kin, and moved down into an old brick cottage that sat beside the road in a gnarled old apple orchard, and had become the "friend to man." Through the orchard and past the door of the little house ran the path that led from the settlement to the town, and through her heart and hands flowed most of the love and charity that bound the rich and the poor, brother to brother. Mother Spurlock was never without a bundle in which she carried labor of the poor sold for the gold of the rich, or gifts from the rich back to the needy. I thought of all the long years of service in the vineyard into which her tragedy had thrown her, and I bent and picked up the bundle at our feet and held it with reverent hands. Just a few baby things that Nellie Morgan gave me to fix up a poor little mother only in the village, she came back from her reverie to say cheerfully, as she saw me with the bundle in my hand. Mother Spurlock always refers to the children without the sanction of the law for their birth as the mother onlys, and somehow when she speaks it the name carries a world of tenderness into the heart of the hearer. "Whose now?" I asked her gently, because in a way Mother Spurlock and I bore one another's burdens of spirit. "Harriet Garrett's, and it's a week old now. It's one of the saddest things that ever happened in the village, and we none of us understand. You remember, she taught the district school down in the settlement." "As none of us understand about Martha Ensley. Is all that a mystery still?" I asked, and I stroked the bundle of tiny garments. "Yes, and now she's gone nobody knows where, day before yesterday. Jacob, her father, was rough and violent with her, but only from grief, and she forgave all that. I'm troubled sorely, for she is gentle, and not one to fight the world alone. She must have gone to the city. The good Lord help her." "He will. He is," I answered quickly, then stopped because I knew I must not tell what I had overheard. Should I say in the confessional? "Praise God, to hear you speak such words. Sometimes a body's faith gets out of her heart past her mind and proclaims itself before the higher criticism gets a chance to throttle it," the invincible old warrior exclaimed, with a delighted twinkle in her young blue eyes at having caught me with religious goods on me. "He will. He will take care of us all. Not that he doesn't expect us to put in about 16 hours of the day helping him to do it for ourselves and others. That reminds me that I seem to be growing to this chair. Luella May Spain has got a nice place to work in the telegraph station with Mr. Pate, and if she's to look neat she needs a few white shirtwaists. I could get them in this bundle. If I get too many things from you and Harriet this morning to carry myself, Hampton will take me down the hill in his car when he goes to lunch. Not that I wouldn't be frightened to death to ride with him except on the Lord's mission." "Do you think that fact would keep Hampton from being run down by Harriet when she cuts corner biases, as she insists on doing?" I asked, as I started in the door to procure the toilet necessities to Luella May's telegraph career, whether it devastated my supply of tennis clothes or not. Nothing that any woman, or any member of her family, in Goodloets wears or eats is secure from Mother Spurlock, and we have all submitted to the fact with great docility. "I know it does, and 3 shirtwaists will be enough if you add a neat black belt," was the answer that followed me through the hall. "Bless my life, Nicholas Powers, I was glad to see you at prayer meeting last week, even if you and William Cockrell were just caught up out at your club in your chess game," I heard her exclaim, to draw a laughing answer in father's most genial rumble. Then I heard him call loudly for Dabney, and when Sally descended with my bundle, that contained a complete telegraph outfit for Luella May, which showed a decided leaning to tennis style, she met Dabney on the front threshold with a rough parcel from which I saw a shirt sleeve and a blue serge trouser leg protrude. "Thank you, Nicholas. Since his accident Bill Hanks has thinned out to just about your size. Now he can go back to his job neatly and respectably clad," Mother Spurlock was saying. "The citizens of Goodloets had better take the habit of wearing double suit of clothes for fear of having Elsie Spurlock strip them in public to beyond the law," Father grumbled in great pleasure, after he had packed her and her bundles in Hampton's car. Father always calls Mother Spurlock Elsie, and once or twice I have seen a faint blush creep into her cheeks and a glint flash from her eyes, but he blandly goes on doing it. I wonder. "Father," I said, as we went slowly up the front walk together, "Nicholas will be here on Friday. Will you have Danby get his rooms in the north wing ready for him? He likes that light, and he can use the long green room for a studio when he sketches." "That's good," answered Father heartily. "He likes Nickols, and Nickols manages him beautifully by giving him all he wants to drink whenever he suggests it, even introducing him to new Manhattan beverages. There is perpetual war between Danby, who knows Father's nervous limit, and Nickols, who doesn't care just as long as things and human beings that surround him are kept pleasant. It is all right for the rest of the world to have delirium tremens, just so they do it out of his sight and hearing." "I wonder just what Nickols will think of Goodloe," Father added, with a slightly strained laugh. "You thought he would be enraged at Goodloe and me for building the chapel and weeding the garden. Perhaps he will be unhappy." "I don't believe your weeding would make anybody unhappy, Father," I answered with a laugh, choosing to ignore the issue of the building of the chapel until Nickols was upon the scene and could decide just what to do. "Been over the whole garden twice and eaten several meals in the sweat of my brow. That is, I took a cold shower before coming to the table, my daughter," Father said, and he looked ashamed of himself for being proud of his own spurt of a normality. I caught my breath, but I was wise enough not to show my astonishment. "Goodloe is the most insinuating person I ever met, and I advise you to be careful. He makes men do just as he wants them to, and I should say that women would eat out of his hand. I suppose I ought to eat a bite or two from his fingers, to pay for all the work he has got out of you and Dabney. I never saw the garden so beautiful or so early. Look, Father, the peonies are budding, 2 weeks ahead of their usual time." "They'd be damned ungrateful not to show industriously, after the way Dab and I have sprained our old backs, spading and feeding them according to spiritual direction that stood over us with a rake," answered Father, with proud if profane enthusiasm. There was a faint pink glow in his haggard thin cheeks, and he took from his pocket a huge knife I had never seen him use before and began carefully to cut away a few dead twigs from a budding rose vine. "Your mother always put a rose from this vine at my plate for breakfast, and you got yours from that pink bush over there by the sundial," he said, with a softness in his voice that I had not heard since my 10th summer, in which my mother had died. I tingled all over, but held on to myself. "You go and tell that old black lazybones to come here with his spade this minute. I told him about digging in this mulch yesterday before the dahlias sprouted, and he hasn't done it. I'm not going to do it for him, like I put the fertilizer around the lilacs, just to save him from Goodloe. Tell him to come right here to me, and not to let grass grow in his shoe tracks." And Father picked up a hoe from the walk beside the neglected dahlias and began doing the work he had just declared against. I fled around to the kitchen, and something lent wings to my feet. "Oh, Dab, what does it mean that Father is really taking an interest in the garden?" I demanded of the faithful old black friend, whom I found enveloped in a kitchen apron helping his wife bring the dinner to a serving head. "Praise God, his salvation am commenced, if it don't kill me before he gets it," answered Dab, who put his hand to his back and groaned. "They has been just 1/2 a demijohn of devil heart whiskey ordered up out'n that cellar in over a month. And I believe this here no account nigger drunk a pint of that," Mammy added to his answer. "Last month it was 2 demijohns they had up, and before that it was 3 or 4. That parson done it with readin' and talkin' and hoein'. Glory! I wants to hold my breath and shout at the same time, and I would if I could trust this pullet in the skillet to either you or Dabney whilst I did it. The Lord wouldn't listen to no shoutin' from a cook whose chicken was fryin' black while she did her praisin'. and as she spoke Mammy began a low humming, swaying from table to stove with a rhythm in the swing of her fat body that had a certain dignified beauty to it. It was crude emotion, and I knew it, but I felt it work in my own body as I let the significance of what she had told me about the lessening amount of whiskey father had been consuming add itself to the scene upon the back porch and sink fully into my consciousness. I didn't know what might have happened to my shouting Methodist grandmother's worldly though emotional descendant if father's voice, sharp and clear, with a note of command I had forgotten it possessed, had not interrupted me. "Charlotte! Dab!" it called, and we both answered with all speed. "That Parson Goodloe have got the power to draw the teeth of 7 devils, and you both consider the words of his mouth, or he'll get the teeth out of yourn," Mammy called after us in ambiguous warning. And upon our arrival on the scene of action being executed upon the dahlias, we found the commander of the devils awaiting us, though in his hands was no forked instrument of dentistry, but in one he held a large slice of rye bread, thickly spread with butter, and the other was disarmed by a ripe red apple. As we drew near he finished a direction to father, and took a huge bite out of the slab of bread that left a gap as wide as one would expect a Harpeth jaguar to make. "Harrowing deep makes great growth in all plant life," he was saying, past the slice of bread, with agricultural prosiness to father, who had completely sweated down the very high and stiff collar which he always wore swathed in a wide tie of black after a Henry Clay cut, in a savage attack with the hoe upon the mulch that was smothering the dahlias in richness. "Does the same deep digging result hold true in biological and psychic life?" puffed father, and then he leaned on his hoe and looked up at the young man towering over him. In his eyes was the appeal of disappointed age calling to the ideals of flaming strength and youth in the deep jeweled eyes that answered with a look of passionate tenderness as the parson poised the bread for another bite. "Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, Mr. Powers, is the direct data we have on that subject," he said. Then he, for the first time, observed the approach of Dabney and myself, of which his widening smile and the quick lowering of the slab of rye prone gave notice to father, who exploded accordingly. "You black son of a gun! Why didn't you rake off these dahlias, as I told you to yesterday? Now you get his hide, parson," was the greeting that Dabney received, while I was ignored by all concerned. "That hinge in your back rusty again, Dabney?" questioned the parson, with leonine mildness. "I been upsot by my young mistis comin' home," answered Dabney, with a glance at me, as if to indicate me as a substantial excuse for any crimes. I stood convicted, for I do use Dabney continually in all my hospitalities. "We understand, Dabney," was the answer he got from the feeding jaguar, who gave me that glint of a laugh that I had learned to expect and to dread. I knew what he meant to imply, and I also knew that he knew I understood that he considered me a disturbing element. Then he again raised the half demolished hunk of bread to his mouth, stopped, and regarded the apple in meditative indecision. From head to heels he was clothed in the most exquisite white flannel and buckskin tennis clothes, but for all their civilized worldliness he resembled nothing so much as a feeding king of the forest, in the poise of his wonderful head and equally wonderful body. I glanced quickly at his face with its gentle, deep, comprehending lines, in positive fear of him, and I found reassurance in the smile that curled his strong red mouth and glinted at me from his brilliant eyes under dull gold. Then, after the smile, he decided for the apple rather than further conversation, and was just going to set his white teeth in its rosy cheek when I stopped him with an almost involuntary exclamation. "Don't!" I pleaded. "Dinner is just ready, and you'll spoil it if you eat all that bread and butter and apple." Just exactly a week before, at almost that exact hour, the Reverend Gregory Goodloe had refused the cup of tea I had stood holding for him in my hand for 5 minutes on the front porch of the Poplars, and I had taken a resolve that never would he again receive a food invitation from me. I didn't count Mammy's snack, eaten on the Harpeth adventure. I didn't understand myself and my sudden rush of dismay at the idea of a spoiled dinner for him, but I couldn't stop myself as I added, "Mammy has apple dumplings and hard sauce. Please don't, I mean, please do come in to dinner with us." "Thank you, but as you see I've about dined," he answered me, as with a laugh he held out his fragments. "Jefferson was feeling badly, and I sent him to bed instead of to the parsonage kitchen." Mammy had told me that the Reverend Mr. Goodloe had taken hers and Dabney's cherished and perfectly worthless only son as his sole domestic dependence, and Mammy had added the fact that Jeff had "shot nary crap since the parson rescued him from the jaw of the jail." "Huh!" ejaculated Dabney over the hoe he had taken from father and was using at his direction while father lined the border beside the bed with his sharp spade. I knew the contempt in his voice was for the illness of Jefferson, and the Reverend and Mr. Goodloe and I both laughed as he took the last bite of the brown slab and then held out the unbitten side of the apple to me. "You eat your fruit with me, not in dumplings with hard sauce," he said, and there was a wooing note in his voice as if he pleaded for that friendliness from me to heal a hurt. "No, I won't eat out of your hand," I answered, with a cool emphasis on the "I." And I looked him straight in the eyes, for I wanted him to know that I had thoroughly understood his refusal of my invitation couched so gently, but which I considered in reality haughty and resentful, especially as I had been his guest in his car. "We'll wait until you get your shower, father, and not much longer," I said to father, as I turned and went along the flagstones to the steps that led to the balcony upon which opened the long windows of the dining room. I was furious and I was hurt. At times I become acutely conscious that I am very imperious, but it is not entirely my fault. My friends have depended upon my clear head, in which father's brain seems to work with a kind of feminine vigor, and I have always felt that the superior force with which I have loved and cherished them made it all right. I've always stood by them and used myself mercilessly for their exigencies, and I suppose I have ruled them as mercilessly. I rarely encounter another will, and to clash into one as strong as mine drew the sparks of my nature. The blaze was soon over, but I smoldered. During dinner I was deeply interested in father's plans for my garden, which brilliantly carried the plans Nichols and I had made to what I saw in another year would be a marvelously artistic completeness. But under the joy of hearing him talk, as I had never really heard him since I was old enough to appreciate his scintillating delicious choice of words and phrases, I was hot and sore at the thought of my duty to render gratitude where gratitude was due for having him like that. "It will be perfectly wonderful, father, and Nichols had not worked it out to anything like that completeness. He will be wild about it. But won't it take a lot of money? And where did you get your inspiration?" I asked the question, though I hated the answer I knew it must receive. "The plans are entirely my own," answered father, with a pleased flush making even brighter his dulled eyes and cheeks, faintly glowing from the shower at which Dabney had officiated a few minutes before. I had not failed to notice that we had sat down and were halfway through dinner, and father's hand had not motioned Dabney towards the decanter and ice and siphon on the sideboard. I must confess that the inspiration came from a kind of rage when Goodloe said to me how much it was to be regretted that all the great gardens in the north are being made out of a sort of patchwork of English, French, Italian, and even Japanese influences. You couldn't expect anything more of the inhabitants of the part of the country in the veins of whose people flowed just about that mixture of blood, but in the Harpeth Valley we have been Americans for 2½ centuries, and I'll show 'em an American garden if it does unhinge both mine and Dabney's backs, and make Cockerell swear I'm crazy when he audits my accounts once every month. No, madam, your own grandmother and great-grandmother, in conjunction with Goodloe's maternal ancestors, conceived and laid out the beginning of the great American garden, and we will combine to produce it." "What about Nichols's plans?" I asked, trying hard to raise indignation in my heart and voice at the thought of Nichols Morris Powers's work, for which the people of wealth in the north were beginning fairly to clamor, being criticized and laid aside at the inspiration of a Methodist parson across the lilac hedge. And I succeeded better than I expected, for I saw father lose color and tremble with his own rage, which he always quells with a drink. "That sunken garden is Italian, and I'm going to tear it out and put— Oh, my daughter, forgive me, but I forgot, in this queer nature frenzy that has come over me of late and which I do not at all understand, that the garden is yours, was your mother's and grandmother's. So far the plans have just been begun, and nothing that you and Nicholls have done. Dabney, pour me 3 fingers of the 1875 bourbon." And in a second I saw father grow white and shaking with mortification at what he felt to be an unmannerly trespass upon another's rights. My father has been a drunkard for nearly 20 years, but he is still a great gentleman. Slowly he drank the whiskey, every drop of which seemed to go to my heart like cold lead. "But, father," I exclaimed, determined to win him back. Dabney was putting the silver stopper in the decanter over by the sideboard, and I thought I saw a sob shake his bent old shoulders as his black hand trembles. "I'd like to know if I'm not as purely American as you are, and have I not the same right to want, demand, and work for an American nationalism, even in a garden, as you have? I'll have you know, sir, that the future of the nation is in the hands of the women. We can produce pure Americans, or let the whole country go hybrid." And as I spoke I let my temper rise to a point which I hoped would shock father and take his mind from the decanter and the ice. "I demand that you allow me to carry out your plans for my garden, and that you help me do it to the limit of the hinges in your back and Dabney's. And, Dabney, don't let me hear another word about that hinge until those dahlias are in bloom. Also get me half a dozen bottles of dynamite to blow out that Italian garden. I never did like it." "Yes'm," answered Dabney, meekly but comprehendingly, for he hastily flung a napkin over the ice and gently set the decanter back in its rack. "But dynamite, it comes in sticks and not in bottles, and it would shake the roots of them old poplars clean most down to hell." "How'll we get that sunken garden out, then, father?" I asked, and I saw the life and color come back to his face in a flood of humor. "We might try filling it in," he answered, and then we both laughed at ourselves, with Dabney joining in. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 7. The Tristan Love Song. After dinner, father and I sat out on the porch in the soft, warm breeze that waved a misty spring moonlight around us, and talked garden until after 10 o'clock. He was brilliant and delightful, but 3 times he made trips to ice bowl and decanter on the sideboard. "It will be a great relief and happiness to me if Nicholas does sanction and set the seal of artistic approval upon our plans," he said, with feverish but happy eyes. "You see, Nicholas will represent the cosmopolitan in judgment upon the normally developed insular. I remember once that Mr. Justice Harlan said that in an opinion on freight rates I had sent up to him, I had represented both the cosmopolitan and the insular interest with astonishing equity, and I told him that I considered that it took at least 6 generations of insular mind culture to see any kind of national equity. The same thing holds good with the garden. It takes the 6th generation on a piece of land to produce a garden, and then it has to be laid out around a library full of the ideals of poet and scholar. In about 3 years I can, with your permission, present the American nation with a garden that will represent the best ideals of Americans. And I must go to bed if I expect to get up and hunt the early worm. I can never decide which is the harder work, the capture of that creature of tradition, or the arousing of Dabney to perform that task. You, Dabney." "Yes, sir," came a sleepy groan from just within the door, and in a second the old black face was lit up with father's candle until the white wool above shone like a halo as it appeared from out the gloom. And I sat and watched the 2 old gentlemen, one black and one white, toil slowly up the steps and down the wide hall of the Poplars. "Father must come back. The nation needs him," I said fiercely under my breath, as I noticed that in Dabney's hand swung the ice bucket where I had been accustomed to see it swing for years, but which I had not seen him carry before since I came home. "And that's how you help him fight to come back." I arraigned myself with bitter scorn. "You have no faith nor spiritual sources yourself, and you throw him back into degradation when something is helping him crawl out. What's helping him? No matter what it is, you are a coward to obstruct it." And for a long hour I sat thus raging at myself and questioning hopelessly, while the young moon rose higher and higher over the tops of the silvery poplars and young spring slipped about in the light and shadows, invisible except for perfumed wreathings of gossamer mist. Above, I heard father pacing up and down his rooms, slowly, almost feebly. Sometimes he would hesitate, then I would hear him stop beside the window, where I knew the ice bowl and the decanter were placed upon a table which had stood beside the head of his bed so burdened since my early childhood. I had always dreaded his moroseness and instinctively felt the cause of it. I had never really loved him until just the last few days, and now I felt my love rise in a tide that threatened to overwhelm me. "Oh, I've found him, and now I've thrown him away," I sobbed to myself. Then, as I sat listening, I heard the faltering steps come out into the hall above, descend the steps one by one, go through the dark dining room groping pitifully, and down the side steps out into the beloved garden. Silently I watched the tall figure with the white hair silvered radiantly by the moonlight go slowly down the path, past the old graybeard poplars, and even up to the lilac hedge that ran as a bulwark in front of the dark chapel door, which I could see was ajar, as it always is. "He's going for help," I muttered to myself, and I felt the padding of fear pursuing me, while also something of the Methodist grandmother within me began a queer calling and a tightening at my throat. Then something happened that interested me so that I lost all personal anxiety. Father stopped beside the hedge and picked up something from the grass. I saw it was a long, heavy hoe. Walking over to a long bed of early roses he and Dabney had been fertilizing in the late afternoon, he bent feebly and began to dig the food into their roots. As he swung the long handle, each blow upon the soft earth became more decided. I crept down behind the old snowball bush to be nearer him. I didn't dare go to him in his fight, because I had in my selfish heedlessness brought it all on. But in a little while he was not alone, for a bent old figure with grizzled white wool sticking out from under a red flannel nightcap came quietly along the path with a hoe in his hand, fell in directly behind his master, and began a rhythmic blow-answering-blow contest with the fragrant earth and the demon within the man. For at least an hour the two old friends worked up and down the long bed, until I could see father begin to totter with weakness. "Now come on, Mas' Nick, honey, and go to bed. I'll pour a bucket of cistern water over you and rub you down so as you'll sleep like a bug in a rug," the staunch old comrade crooned, with a mother note in his voice, as he took father's heavy hoe and shouldered it with his. "I think evening exercise is good for me, Dabney," answered father, with all the dignity and command come back into his voice. "Put both those hoes in the tool house at this time, and I'll not tell Mr. Goodloe you left one down by the lilac hedge." "Yes, sir, thanky, sir, for not telling him," answered Dabney, as he followed his master to the tool house under the back steps, deposited the garden implements where he was directed, and then again followed his idol in through the long dining room window and was lost in the shadow. I went back to the front steps again and sank down, put my arms on my knees and let my head fall upon my clasped hands. As I sat there alone, with the dark house yawning behind me in its emptiness, someone sat down beside me and laid a warm, strong hand on my interlaced and strained fingers for just about a half a second. "Please forgive me about the apple dumplings and the hard sauce," a merry, lovely voice pleaded. "I went out to old Harpeth with you when you asked me, but I loathe going to church. I haven't been in one since I was strong enough to rebel, and I'm not going to yours," was the apology I graciously offered in return for that about the apple dumplings. "But I'd pay $50 for a 10th row seat to hear you sing Tristan in the Metropolitan any day if I had to go hungry for a week to pay it," I added, as I laughed as softly as he had pleaded. All the sorrow and strain of the last hours had vanished at the touch of his hand, and I felt like an impish, teasing child. "I'll sing some of it for you now if you'll give 50 cents to Mother Spurlock for the Children's Day picnic, and it'll be a bargain you are getting," was the unexpected offer I encountered. "And a freezer of vanilla ice cream to boot," I assented generously. And then something happened to me the like of which I know never happened to anybody in all the world, and that could only happen the once to me. Gregory Goodloe drew a little closer to me, and bent his great gold head until his face was just off my left shoulder, and in his powerful, rich, fascinating voice, which he muted down in a way that made it sound as if he were singing through a golden cloud, he sang Tristan's immortal love agony in a way that shut out all the rest of the universe and left me alone with him in a space swayed by his pleading until my mortal body shook in actual pain. "Don't! "I can't stand it," I gasped, as I seized his wrist in my strong hands and wrung it. "Stop." The last tender note breathed itself into the air that seemed to hold it in a long caress until it died away, and sobs shook me as I held on desperately to his wrist. I felt that I must be comforted. And I was. Again the gentle fingers were laid over mine for a still smaller fraction of a second, and then again the beautiful clear voice began to sing to me, just to me, out of the whole world. "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide," he chanted, and then waited while my sobs died away and I let go my drowning grasp on his wrist. "That's just what I mean. That's just why I wouldn't have any more respect for myself if I should go to your church than if I joined in one of Mammy's foot washings down at the river and fell in a fit of shouting in which it took 2 burly coons to hold my spirit down," as she describes those gymnastics to me. "I hate you and I hate my friends for indulging in religion, because it is just as potent an agent of intoxication as exists today, and it blinds us to the need of working along scientific lines for the immediate improvement of the race. What right have we to intoxicate reason with religion? If religion is anything, it must be reason." I fairly hurled my words of half-baked skepticism at him, with the vision of Father and Dabney digging in the garden still in my eyes. "I felt just as you do about it a year ago today," he answered me quietly. "As you state the case of religion as emotion versus reason, it doesn't exist. Religion is reason plus emotion, and when you combine the two, the eyes of your soul are open, whereas they had been closed. Nobody can tell you about it, but you begin really to live when you see and comprehend. Yes, it is going to take all the scientific reason the world possesses to start its salvation, but it will not get far without emotion, as you call what I know is the love of God, and through that love, compassion for man." "The assumption that every man is blind who does not believe as you do stops all argument," I said scornfully. "I didn't come to talk religion with you. I came over to get that apple dumpling off my conscience, as I couldn't digest it because it wasn't there. I preach twice, on Sunday and on Wednesday night, and I'm in my study behind the altar every afternoon that I'm not playing tennis. I'll be there any time by appointment." The worldly and protective raillery in that young Methodist minister's voice almost interrupted my religious researches, but I was in depths that were strange to me, and I was floundering for a line out. "I'll never be there," I flared at him, then went on with my floundering. "If a man is blind, how can he gain the sight that you arrogate to yourself?" "A great man once prayed, 'Lord, help thou my unbelief,'" was the gentle answer in which was that queer note of apostolic surety with which I heard him address the woman in the garden that night. "I can't pray. There's nothing there," I said in a very small voice that I could scarcely recognize as my own. "Oh, I mean that we are all floundering, and where can we get the lifeline? Where did you get that line that you think will pull you out of the vortex?" Then for a long moment he and I sat again involved in the emptiness of the universe that Tristan's love song had opened for us, and I knew that with ruthless feet I had entered his holy of holies and was being allowed to stand across the threshold. "Forgive me," I gasped. "I never felt that I could tell it before," he said slowly, and the bounds of the emptiness retreated still further away as he turned so that he sat facing me and again bent his dull gold head closer to mine. In a second I knew why in my mind I had been calling him a Harpeth jaguar. It was just my pictorial expression for the word freedom, the freedom that comes from power. I knew that mentally and bodily I was looking upon the first free man I had ever encountered, and I was abashed. "Don't tell me," I said, with a gentleness in my voice I had never heard before, and that came from something I felt to be strangely like meekness, though I had never before met that emotion in myself. "You know the romance of my father's life," the soft voice went on, speaking as if I had not interrupted him, "but nobody knows the tragedy. Love for my mother came upon him like an arrow shot out of ambush, and he married into a worldly, pleasure-loving, agnostic circle of people who all adored and flattered him until he became confused and doubting. He had transgressed the law, 'Yoke not yourself with unbelievers,' and he suffered. She never understood. It killed him, and when he had been dead nearly 20 years, I found the diary he kept months before he died. It was last year, just after her death. It was a cry to me, who at that time was a mere babe, and it lighted the flame he had almost let go out. As I read, the apostolic call came to me, and I answered. I was starting to the front in France, and I went on. my year there was a series of experiences that gave me my surety. One day it came more clearly than ever. I had gone out into one of the trenches of the first line, because I am so strong that I can carry any man back to the stretchers across my back or in my arms. I have carried 2 at a time. There were 19 men in the trench and I made the 20th. Suddenly a machine gun found the range and mowed them all down like cornstalks or wheat heads. Only I was left standing, bleeding under my left ribs. I raised my voice and praised God for my surety of immortality, and then fell. While I was practically dying in the hospital with a clip in my lung, I got suddenly and unaccountably well and strong, and felt I must come back to try and help others to see what we must see to assure every man of his immortality, when the race awakens to the fact that there will be no more use for machine guns. I may not help much, but I can only try. Perhaps I do work through the emotions as yet, but I believe that my ministry will have its fruits. I can wait." And the humility and patience in his voice beat against my heart and bruised it so that I cried out, "Oh, why did you come here?" I positively moaned, as he and I both rose, and I put out my hand as if to force him out of that aloneness in which we stood together. America must lead the world in spiritual as well as material regeneration, and this is the only real and dispassionate America, with no foreign pull on its vitals. You must wake up. The cry has been heard to come over and help. Why do you fight the... I can't help fighting. I must do what I conscientiously believe," I was saying, with my hand still outstretched against him, when suddenly the still place around us was invaded with a crash and its invisible walls thrown down. "Charlotte," came in Nicholas's languid, fascinating voice that always draws me to the edge of his world. "And Greg Goodloe, by all that is good and holy, in tennis flannels!" End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 8. Breasting the Gale. In the radiant moonlight I saw the lithe muscles of the jaguar grow taut and stiff, and I felt, rather than saw, his long, strong hands clench to themselves. I was about to stretch out my arms and ward off something that seemed like danger to Nickols, standing down at the bottom of the steps, smiling up at us in the moonlight with his mocking, fascinating smile, when suddenly the anger seemed to flow away from the body of the parson, and he smiled down into the upturned eyes with great gentleness as we started down the steps together. "I didn't interrupt the salvation of Charlotte's soul, did I?" Nickols asked, as he took my outstretched hand in his left hand and raised it to his lips as he held out his right to the Reverend Mr. Goodloe. So real had been that fraction of an instant when I had stood between the two men that I almost felt the sensation of alarm a second time as I saw Nickols' slender, magical, artist fingers laid in the slim, powerful hand of the Reverend Mr. Goodloe, but the gentle voice reassured me as the Harpeth jaguar answered the intruder, or what he must have felt to be the intruder, for I had something of that feeling myself at the advent of my lover at the moment he had chosen for his arrival. "The trouble began about apple dumplings and hard sauce," I said, as quickly as my wits would act. "How are you, Nickols Powers, since we separated somewhere in France, you with your sketch books and I with my hospital stretchers? I got a dandy lung clip. Did you bring away any lead?" And the parson's voice was gentle and cordial and full of a laughing reminiscence. "Didn't smell powder after I left you," answered Nickols, as we all ascended the steps and stood in a group before the door. "I got my books full of sketches of bits of treasures that the war might destroy and beat it back to civilization. Did the Madonna of the Red Cross you had in tow come across as sentimentally as was threatened?" Nickols' voice was as cordial as the Reverend Goodloe's, but something in me made me resent the question in the manner it was asked. "She was killed in a field hospital just a few weeks after we left her, somewhere in France. She got God's welcome," was the answer that came to the laughing question in a quiet, reverent voice. And as he spoke the parson started down the steps, then turned for his farewell. "That or sweet oblivion," said Nickols as he came to the edge of the steps and looked down at the Harpeth jaguar coolly. I again got the sense of danger from the tall lithe figure that stood in the moonlight, radiant before us in the shadow. We'll contest that point warmly while we contest the meeting house Charlotte writes me that you planted in our garden of Eden. I can contest, if I must," was the serene answer that came back at us from over the white silk-clad shoulder. "Good night, both of you, and I hope to see you both again soon. Smell the lilacs bursting bud in your garden of Eden." With which farewell he left us to our greetings. "That's some man to be lost in the ranks of the shibboleths," said Nickols with generous ease, as we watched the last glint of the moon on the yellow head disappearing around the corner. "Degrees from 3 old colleges, millions, women lovers in millions, all thrown away to sing psalms for a few rustics in little old Goodloets. Can you beat it? But blast him, he can't take away my loving welcome with his fatal beauty." And as he spoke, with a tender laugh Nickols held out his arms to me. I went into them and he held me close. "I couldn't stay away, with Goodloe and the meeting house in the ring against me," he whispered, and he tried to raise my head for the kiss I had been holding from him all the long winter of our engagement, claiming to want it only under the roof of the poplars. I burrowed my face in his shoulder and held to him with such fervor that it was impossible for him to raise my head. "Not yet," was my muffled pleading. "Again, damn that huge blond giant for being in the way of my getting my own on the first sight wave," said Nickols with a good-humored laugh as he pushed me from him. "Take your time. I like ripe fruit and kisses. Did you say Goodloe had come over to steal apple dumplings and you had caught him in the act? I never was so hungry before, and one of Mrs. Dabney's apple dumplings with that hard sugar stuff smothered with cream. Well, of course I could wait until breakfast, but I'd be mighty weak. Your night train carries no dining car." "I feel sure that there is at least a half panful in the pantry. Let's go see," I answered with delight at the practical turn the scene had taken, and I led him into the dark house, turned on 1 or 2 lights and went with him back into the culinary department of the Poplars. And as I had predicted, so we found the larder supplied. With a huge plate of the pastry encrusted apples, smothered with all the cream from one of Mammy's pans of milk, and a tall bottle from the sideboard, Nickols led the way out of the long windows onto the south balcony over which the moon, now high in the heavens, poured the radiance of a new-toned daylight. I followed him with some glasses and sugar and a bowl of cracked ice that I had found in its usual place in the corner of the refrigerator. "Pretty good substitute for the affectionate sweet I thought of all the way down from New York," said Nickols with an adorable laugh, as he lifted the first spoonful, dripping with cream, to his mouth. Then, with the food almost bestowed, he paused and looked out beyond the garden toward the chapel, which loomed up gray and shimmering in the silver light. "Great heavens!" he ejaculated, and for a long minute the spoon was poised while his eyes fairly devoured the scene spread out before him against the background of Paradise Ridge. "If you don't like it, we can get rid of it," I said, as I poured his drink over the ice tinkling against the side of the glass. "Not like it!" exclaimed Nickols, as he rose with a spoonful of dumplings dashed back into the plate. "That is the most wonderful and beautiful landscape effect I have ever beheld. That is just what our garden needed. I suppose I would have seen it and put some sort of pavilion there, but that squat and perfect old church would have been beyond me." "Oh, I'm glad!" I exclaimed, as he sank back on the step beside me, took the glass from my hand, drank deeply, and this time began a determined attack upon the plate in his hand. And then, as he ate, I told him all about father and his plans for the garden and his own improvement and to what I hoped the work was leading him. But somehow I couldn't bring myself to describe the scene which had that night been enacted in the garden. I couldn't. "Oh, I am so glad you are not furious and will maybe be willing to encourage him, even if it does mean to encourage the Methodist Church and the minister thereof. You are wonderful, Nickols," I finished with a squeeze of his arm that very nearly jostled the cream out of the spoon upon his gray tweed trousers. "I'd be a wonderful ass not to take advantage of Judge Nickols Powers's brain and money, plus Gregory Goodloe's brain and training and money combined, to get a result that will be worth $100,000 to me and all the fame I can conveniently wear. Encourage 'em? Just watch me. Only what the judge thinks will take 2 years can be done in 1 season if we get experts down to it, which we will. Trees 200 years old can be moved for a few $1,000s, as well as plants in bloom that would require years to transplant. I know the man to do it. Wilkerson of White Plains. I'll telegraph him in the morning." "He won't interfere with father, will he?" I asked anxiously. "Not a bit. He'll just make what the judge and Gregory planned for year after next, grow and bloom there in a couple of months. Wilkerson is not a creator, he's just nature keyed up to the nth power. And also I'll give him for a bait that Jeffrey's estate I was hesitating about making a bid for. All the big fellows are after it. Old man Jeffries has made 2 barrels of money in the last 10 years in oil, and he is going to build an estate up on the Hudson that will make the world gasp. I hadn't put in a bid, but this idea of the Judges and Greggs with the whole village grouped about it has given me the keynote to win this thing from the whole bunch of American architects. He wants the village built as well as the estate. That American garden idea will bowl him over. He's progressively and rabidly American. The bids don't close until December, so I'll have time to get real photographs and sketches. Me for the reformed judge and the parson." "That is the most wonderful thing I ever heard, and I want father pushed to the limit with the planning. I don't care where the parson comes in, just so I don't have to join the church to get the garden," I said, as I tinkled the ice in Nickols' empty glass, while he consumed the last bit of cream from the empty plate. "Oh, I'll join the church if it is needed to push the garden," said Nickols with a laugh, as he lit a cigarette and puffed a smoke ring out toward the gray little chapel. "Most people who join churches do it for some kind of pull, social or business, or a respectability stamp, or to be whitewashed. I'll put on a frock coat and pass the plate if it will help the parson evolve another phase of gardenism." "Billy gets home from his poker game at the Last Chance down in the settlement on Sunday morning just in time to bathe and get into his frock coat to perform that office," I said with a laugh that had a hint of recklessness tinged with contempt. "I'll see Billy through both ceremonials," said Nickols. "Has Billy come into the fold?" "He has. So have all the rest," I answered. "I am the only black sheep, and they are all backsliding down on me. I am getting, and will get, the blame of it all as a corrupter of public morals." "Why don't you join and then do as you please with the official stamp of Christianity upon you?" Nickols asked, as he puffed comfortably away in the moonlight. One of the things that cause me the deepest hurt is to try to get Nickols to look down into my depths and read one, just any one, of the hieroglyphics there. I know each time I open my nature to him he is going to turn aside, and yet I will try. As his arm stole around me I made another one of the attempts that I always know beforehand are doomed to failure. There is something in me, a quality of mind that seems to be judicial, which insists that as a cold scheme for existence in the universe nothing compares with that of life followed by eternal redemption through personal effort interpreted by a mediator. The bare Christian tenets have a nobility that it kills me to see belittled by the bored, half-hearted observances of most of its Protestants, who in turn are not to be blamed for being half-hearted and bored by the dogmas and restrictions and littleness with which the great bare scheme has been enmeshed and clothed. The Methodist Church positively forbids Billy to play poker or drink, but it just as positively forbids him to see Pavlova dance, or Beerbohm Tree play Falstaff, or Forbes Robertson incarnate Hamlet. And look at its wretched machinery. They allow a young man to give his life and expect inspiration from him at $600 a year with a wife and 24 children, when he has been encouraged to bring down upon himself dependent on that same $600. The great men who are expected to direct our spiritual destinies don't get as much money as ordinary grocers, and certainly not enough to support their obligations with dignity. What is true of the Methodist Church is true of all the rest, in perhaps a greater degree. So with their smallness and their pettiness and their befogging stupidity, I feel that they may be denying thinkers like you and me the use of their scheme, and we'll have to find another for ourselves if we want immortality." "Do we want that immortality?" asked Nickols easily. "This world is a pretty good old place if you don't regard the shall nots, but isn't it long enough to live the allotted time? What do we want to do it all over again for, that is, provided we do all the pleasant things while we have the chance? I don't want to see any play twice, even a masterpiece. I wouldn't want to live again unless I had been a Christian in this life and felt that I wanted to come back and do a lot of things I had just heard about and previously hadn't tried." "Certainly, I wouldn't want another life that is as satisfied as this," I murmured, more to myself than to Nickols. "Do the things that satisfy," he urged again, and I could see a deviltry dancing at me out of the corner of his eyes that I resented deeply without exactly knowing why. "Harriet Henderson can't get Mark Morgan's love, or his children, and Nell Morgan is unattainable for Billy. Though they have all the world's goods and go a pace that pleases them, they are unsatisfied. If they don't get the new deal that immortality promises, they lose the whole thing," I answered straight out from the shoulder. "And what about those who die in infancy and you and me?" If you'll just kiss me and hush preaching to me, I'll be entirely satisfied and ready to die as soon as I have lifted that 50,000 out of old Jeffries with the judges and the Reverend Gregory's garden, and done a few more commissions. Try kissing me and see if you don't feel more cheerful," Nickols answered with a laugh as he drew me close to him. I sadly shut up the doors of my depths, warded off the kiss, why, I didn't know, and persuaded him to go up to his rooms, which I had seen Sally and Dabney put in order that afternoon. It was midnight when I parted with Nickols at the head of the old winding stairs in the fragrant darkness, lit only by the silver light of the night from a long window at the front of the hall. He held me close for half a second as he whispered, "Let me make you happy. I understand." "I don't understand, and till I do, I'd make you miserable, dear," I whispered back as I drew myself out of his reluctant arms and went into my own door. Then, for a long midnight hour, I stood at my deep window and looked out over the garden, past the squat steeple silvering beyond the lilac hedge, to Paradise Ridge in the dim distance, and tried to read my own hieroglyphics. I needed help. Nickols had come after me to Goodloets in a spirit of gentle determination, and I knew the fight would be to the finish. And why should I fight? Any woman ought to be proud to marry Nickols Morris Powers, especially a woman who had loved him since her heart had been developed to the knowledge of love. Very unostentatiously and with perfect good taste, Nickols had let me see that Marie Van Clive with her Knickerbocker ancestry and her Manhattan land grant fortune was very decidedly interested in him in her cultured and perfected young way, and young Mrs. Houston had herself shown me the same thing on one of the week-end flights we had had on her yacht. And beyond all that, my own heart told me that Nickols was desirable. His gentleness and his tenderness and his daring and his humor were so irresistible to a woman. And his lazy acquiescence in life was peaceful and inviting to my own strenuosity. I felt as if I had always been an eagle breasting the gale with no place to alight, and now Nickols was calling to me from an eyrie on a mountain side to come and rest and be mated and comforted. "I'm tired of loneliness and I think I'll drift and be happy," I murmured, as I fell asleep with my back to the silver steeple against the dim hills. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 9. Into Brambles. The next morning I awoke with the same resolve in my heart, to be happy if wicked, and proceeded to execute it with a great vigor. And in the execution of that resolve, dear old Goodloets almost had some of the moss of its century's repose scraped off of its back. First and foremost we all danced, day and night. We had really begun the giddy whirl the summer before, when we had built the little clubhouse over in the oak grove by the river's edge, just between the town and the settlement, so that we would no longer feel the limit and limitations to our gliding of anybody's double parlors, and conservative Goodloets had been duly shocked thereat. Ladies did not dance outside of their own and their friends' private homes in my day, Mrs. Cockrell had sighed, as she finished the petal of the rose she was embroidering upon some of Leticia's lingerie. "I'd rather they danced in their den of iniquity than to execute these modern gyrations in my home," had responded Harriet's mother, Mrs. Sproul, as she finished the 100th round on the shawl she was knitting. Harriet's report of the conversation had been received with great hilarity that evening at dinner at the club. But Goodloets had had a year in which to recover from the shock of the institution of the country club when I started in to enjoy myself. Having church services there on Sundays and Wednesdays during the winter had done much to remove the prejudice in the minds of the conservative. I suspected the Reverend Mr. Goodloe of a great deal of worldly wisdom when I saw how he had been able to persuade the directors, Hampton Dibrell and Mark and Cliff, to let him do such a weird thing. Mrs. Sproul and Mrs. Cockrell and their friends had first been told out to prayer meeting, and then had come to witness a tennis match. Billy, in great glee, recounted to me the first time they had stayed to dinner with him and father and Mr. Cockrell. They had been enjoying the prayer meetings to the utmost, and had come out with Mother Spurlock by mistake on a Tuesday night, which was the regular dinner dance night. It was some time before they discovered their mistake, for they were immensely enjoying their visit with Mother Spurlock, and when the dancing began, Billy had seized Mother Elsie in his arms and danced her the whole length of the room. The music had been too much for her feet in their sensible shoes, and very suddenly they had unfolded their wings after 30 long years of rest, and had fairly flown up and down and backwards and forwards with Billy's in a sedate version of one of the phases of the tango. Mrs. George Spurlock had been the best dancer in Goodloets when time was young. "Do you think that it was the devil that tempted you, Mother Elsie?" I asked her about it one day when she had a leisure moment for teasing. "Effie Burns's youngest baby was born exactly while I was dancing, and we will have 6 months' trouble with her because her band was not put on properly," was her answer as she took up her parcel of 5 pairs of only slightly worn stockings that 5 girls in the Settlement needed worse than I needed darns, and departed in a great hurry. "Oh, but you should have seen Hattie Sproul's eyes while I danced," she called back over her shoulder as she went through the gate. And so in the second summer of the club's existence there had been no bridle upon its gayeties. I had almost used the word license, and I suppose it would have been a just one under the circumstances. Billy called it the bucket of the lost lid, and every individual member did exactly as he or she chose. The sideboard out on the back porch made as good a bar as any in the state with old Uncle Wilkes to officiate, and in the wing in one of the private dining rooms a huge wheel stood with its face to the wall during the day, but came complacently out of its corner when night descended. On the porch could always be found either Mrs. James Knight or Mrs. Buford Cunningham. They neither of them had children, hated home, and were serenely happy sitting on the front porch knitting silk scarfs and gossiping with all comers, while James and Buford hung around the sideboard at the back. They were institutions, and all of the unmarried boys and girls, men and women, widowed and widowered, came and went at will with the liberty that the chaperonage of their certain presence allowed. "Suppose one of 'em should fall dead and the other have to attend her funeral," Nickols remarked one Saturday night at a dinner table not more than 12 feet away from the two couples. "The scandal that would soon disrupt this town for lack of their free chaperonage would be like an earthquake. None of you would have a shred of respectability with which to drape yourselves to appear in public." "They don't wear much respectability anyway in the eyes of the Settlement," said Billy as he mixed a champagne cup with old Wilkes standing admiringly by. "The floor manager ordered Luella May Spain off the dance floor at the dance they had in the lodge room over the Last Chance last Saturday night for appearing in one of Harriet's last year dancing frocks Mother Spurlock had collected for her, though they do say that Luella May had sewed in 2 inches of tucker and put in sleeves. How's that for an opinion passed upon the high and mighty from the meek and lowly? I'd been in mourning a year. That was my coming out gown, and I felt—" Harriet was saying when Billy laughed and interrupted her. "And you came out, Harriet dear," he assured her, as he poured her champagne cup and his and signaled Wilkes to serve the rest of us. On the surface all of the joy that most of Goodloets was having was real and brilliant and spontaneous, all the dancing and drinking and high playing, but under the surface there were dark currents that ran in many directions. Young Ted Montgomery and Billy played poker one Saturday night until daylight out at the club, and Bessie Thornton and Grace Payne had stayed by and were having bacon and eggs with them when the sun rose. Judge Payne, Grace's father, has been a widower 10 years, and Grace, with the 4 younger Paynes, as Billy calls them, has run wild away from him and her grandmother, old Madam Payne, who lives in a world of crochet needles and silk thread with Mrs. Cockrell and Mrs. Sproul. One night I went with Billy in his car to take Grace home, and he had to wait until I tiptoed to her room with my arm around her and put her to bed. Well, Harriet was doing the same thing with Bessie Thornton. Those girls are not much over 20, and they are only a little more liberated, as they call it, than the rest of their friends. Ted Montgomery loves Grace when he is himself and not at the card table, but what chance have they to form a union of any solidity and permanence? Billy's nephew, Clive Harvey, has always loved Bessie Thornton, but he is a teller in the Goodloets Bank and almost never sees her. He is one of the stewards in the Harpeth Jaguars Church, and the suffering on his slim young face hurts me like a blow every time I meet him. What's going to satisfy him, no matter what pace he should choose to go or how many things he is driven by unhappiness to indulge himself in? And it was true that everything done up in the town had its effect down in the Settlement. The lodge hall over the Last Chance was the only hall available for the young people in the Settlement to dance, and the bar of the East Chance, at which old Jacob Ensley officiated, was no better stocked than the lockers at the country club. And all of us knew that very frequently Billy and Nickols and the rest of our friends went down to dance and drink with the girls from the mills and the shops. Billy had told me once that Millie Burt, who stays at the cigar stand in the Goodloe Hotel in Goodloets, dances so much like me and is so perfumed with my especial sachet from France, Mother Spurlock having collected the chiffon blouse from me for her to wear at the entertainment of the Epworth League, that he came very near addressing her by my name and giving her the invitation to the dance. Settlement or town, they all add up to the sum of girl, he laughed, as he told me about that Saturday night frolic in the Last Chance. It was the day after Billy's account of the ball at the Last Chance, in which Luella May and Millie and the rest had frolicked in what ought to have been a perfectly harmless way, that Mother Spurlock came to spend the afternoon with me, and in which we wrestled until I was almost on the mat. Not quite. Goodloets has always been the gayest town in the state, but it has now reached the place of the most wicked, she said, after a few preliminary shots had been exchanged. Every dignity of tradition seems to have been dropped, and everybody is dance or play or drink or speed mad. You are the most influential personality in the whole town, and I want you to call a halt." "But aren't they all happy? Isn't everybody getting the most out of life? The men are all working to their capacity and making more money than they ever have before. Why shouldn't they play hard?" I answered her, as I seated myself in the broad window seat of my room opposite the wide maternal ancestral rocker she had chosen. "Are they happy?" she asked, with her keen eyes on my face. "They seem to be," I parried. "Well, as far as personal happiness is concerned, I think it is not worth talking about. It is the good of the whole for which I am working, for which I am contending today. What you women do, who are not obliged to add to the work of the world, that you may live in it, is not of any great importance. It is for the toilers in the vineyard that I plead. The girls and young men in this town cannot dance and drink and play all night and do the constructive work of the community in the daytime. If Luella May Spain falls asleep or nods at her typewriter and fails to get out the telegram to you or Nickols which Mr. Tate has shouted to her off the keys, do you excuse her because she has been fatiguing herself until midnight trying to learn some new dance that Billy Harvey has brought down to Last Chance from your country club? You would not. She would be fired on your complaint." "But are we responsible for how the girls and men in the settlement spend their evenings?" I demanded with a fine show of indignation, but with a thrill of fear in my heart. There has always been something in Luella May Spain's shy and admiring glances that drew me, and I've always lingered to chat with her a few minutes, if business called me into the station. The last time I had spoken to her, not a week before, she had seemed pale and listless and had answered me with indifference. You and your class are the ones in power, and what you do and what you think is a moral influence that reaches and permeates every soul in this town. You are not about your father's business, and those less powerful of brain and character follow you in bypaths from the straight road. They are his little ones, and you lead their feet into brambles. Oh, Charlotte!" And Mother Spurlock stretched out her hands to me in entreaty. "I'm not a leader," I denied her. "I don't see a foot ahead of me. I'm not worth anything. I'm just living and trying to have a good time doing it. You have got a leader there over the hedge. Why don't they follow him and not me?" "Before you came, Gregory Goodloe had services 3 times a week at your country club, at which the settlement met the town. You were not willing that even those few hours should be given over to the learning of the Father's will from one whose mind and soul are ready to teach, and you swept away his pews and his influence. And your dance tunes, to which even I yielded, ring in the ears of his flock to drown out the echoes of God's hymns. And now those who had begun to lean on him and to follow him are turning to persecute him. When Jacob Ensley is drunk, he openly charges him with inveigling Martha away and hiding her. He was in a dangerous state one night a week ago, and Billy Harvey had to lock him up in his own wine cellar to keep him and a few of his hangers on from going after the parson, who was down there praying with old Jenny Nell as she died. He doesn't know his danger from Jacob, and I think Billy ought to tell him. All Goodloets has admired and aped you since your birth, and now that you discountenance him, they are again following you. There were only 10 people at prayer meeting last night in the chapel, and the Wednesday before you turned him out of the club, which had offered him its hospitality, there were 130. Settlement and town about evenly represented. You are responsible for that prayer meeting last night. You may be responsible for the result of one of Jacob's drunken fits. Sometime you'll have to answer for what you do." No, Mother Spurlock, I'm not responsible for the failure of Gregory Goodloe to get to the heart of your people and hold them happy to his services and observances, and I'm certainly not responsible for his personal safety. What he offers is not enough to satisfy. His members prefer their country club and their last chance and their knitting and embroidery. What we all need from the country club to the last chance is something that makes us want to be constructive, race constructive, so that life will be desirable on through immortality, if there is such a thing. I can't get a glimpse of it, can you?" And I questioned her beseechingly. "I can. I do. I have faith in my Father's plan to lead me through deep waters into pleasant pastures," she answered me, as her eyes looked past me out at Paradise Ridge beyond the chapel. "Then give it to me," I demanded. "I can't. You must seek it yourself, and when you get it you will be able to pour it out into the hearts of others as living water. I serve by using my 2 talents of mercy and love, but God will some day give you 10, and you will have to return an 100-fold. He has given the 10 to Gregory Goodloe, and now is the night of his despair, but his morning will dawn. You can't dance down and drink down and gamble down and lust down a man like that. He can bide his time until his sheep come to the fold to be fed and warmed in his bosom. What practical thing can I do to make you believe that I do not mean to pull down any structure that another human is building up, with the hope it is for the good of the whole, Mother Spurlock?" I demanded of her, goaded to the last point of endurance. "The dedication services of the chapel will be next Sunday. Come, bring Nickols and your father, and let the town and settlement see your respect for Mr. Goodloe and for his church," she demanded as she rose to go, with patient defeat but a lingering hope in her voice and manner. "Endorse something that means nothing to me?" I asked with pained patience. "You say the people follow me. Shall I lead them to drink from a spring that I consider dry, that is dry and has no water for my thirst? No, Mother Spurlock. If the people among whom I have been born trust me, I will only lead them by going into paths I know and in which I walk for my own good or pleasure." "To the last chance?" "At least the joy they get there makes toil easier or offsets the grind," I answered her. "Is that your final?" she was asking me with her deep, wise old eyes searching me, when she was interrupted by the banging open of my door and the inburst of young Charlotte, young James as ever at her heels, with Sue clinging to his hand. Today, however, Charlotte had added one to her cohorts, for she led by the hand a very dirty specimen of the masculine gender, somewhat larger than herself and with a flaming red head. "This is Mikey Burns, Aunt Charlotte, and he's a nice little boy that's dirty and hungry because his mother has got 7 like him. Won't you wash him and feed him so we can play with him? The preacher cleaned up 4 for us to play with yesterday, and they are still clean enough. If you clean Mikey, I can have a baseball 9 with Sue to get the balls that we don't hit. She gets balls nicely, and Mikey throws lots straighter than I can. Jimmy can hit 'em too with a wide stick." "I can get 'em," declaimed small Sue with great pride. "I can pitch 'em," also declared Mikey with evident desire to back up his patroness, "but not as good as her," and his admiration amounted to adoration as he raised his young eyes to Charlotte. "You see, oh you see, even to the 2nd generation they follow," laughed Mother Spurlock as she escaped through the door and left me with my practical demonstration of class leadership. "Wash him, Auntie Charlotte, wash him," Charlotte continued to insist. "I made Jimmy steal some of his things for him while nurse was downstairs. Here they are," and young James, the thief and aforementioned murderer, gave up his stolen goods. "And Mr. Nickols says that all the settlement children will go to school with us in the nice schoolhouse he and Judge Powers and Minister are going to build in front of Mother Spurlock's orchard. That is a law, and then we'll have good times, all of us. There's not many children in the town, and they are all too dressed up, but it is a million down in the settlement, and we are going to have 2 baseball 9s and 2 armies to battle with. I asked Mr. Nickols to have a place to wash the settlements, and he said he had thought of that and is going to have 5 shower baths. If you'll just wash Mikey for me, I'll help you. I can attend to Jimmy's ears for nurse real good, can't I, Jimmy?" "Yes," responded Jimmy with brotherly pride. "No," remonstrated Mikey with abject fear. For the sake of his ears or propriety, I was not sure. I got past the question by motioning him into my bathroom and sending Charlotte and Sue to bring Dabney. Dabney is Charlotte's slave, and was soon under way to execute her commands upon Mikey, while I beguiled her from the superintendence thereof down into the garden with me, where from my window I could see Nickols and father in deep conclave over some drawings. Father had discarded his Henry Clay costume and looked young and alive in some of Nickols' flannels and linen. They looked up with interest as I came down the flagstone walk with Charlotte trotting on my one side and wee Sue clinging on the other. "I'm glad you have come, daughter," said father as he held up one of the large blueprints before me. "Now you can help Nickols and me locate the exact spot for the public school building. See, here is the public square of Goodloets with the courthouse in the middle." "That courthouse is as good as any minor hôtels de ville in any of the small towns in France," said Nickols as he came and stood beside me, looking over my shoulder at the map. "The Farmers' Bank and one or two of the very old brick stores are good too," he added. "Now, this is Main Street that leads past us down into the settlement. Here is the Poplars, here the chapel, and this is Elsie Spurlock's house. Nickols and the parson are inclined to place the schoolhouse right opposite, but I am afraid it is too near the settlement and too far from the town. Do you suppose the town children will be able to walk so far?" "Do you really plan to have the town and the settlement go to school together?" I gasped. "Well, Goodloe thinks that the ideal public school system is only to be executed in a democratic," father was saying when Nickols interrupted him. "What does it matter where the 2½ kids from the decadent old families that are dying out go to school? Their sterile parents can motor 'em down to education," he exclaimed. "Right here is the logical place for the school, with the meadow behind to give it a bit of distance, the oak grove back of that, the country club beyond with the river beginning to curve it in. It solidifies and unifies the landscape of the whole town and puts all the community centers where they belong. The town and settlement straggled a bit before, but the chapel and the school will unite them. Braid says the schoolhouse can be built of weathered stone and concrete and finished by September 5th, in time to start school. Wilkerson can begin immediately putting out his hedges, and the Reverend Gregory is down there now finishing laying out the playground with his ballpark." "That's it! That's the baseball 9 Dabney is washing Mikey for!" exclaimed Charlotte, catching up with the conversation. "And when we all go to school with the settlements and they are cleaned some, and Mildred Payne and Grace Sproul and some of the others get dirty a little, nobody will know the difference, and we can play ball and scouts and everything minister teaches us. The school makes enough children to do things. We haven't got enough for anything, but the settlements have, and it is mighty good of them to come up and let us play with them." "Keep up with the times, Charlotte. Don't be a back number. Miss Olympia Lassiter's school may have held you and Nell, but it will never hold young Charlotte." Nickols jeered as father began to roll up the map and speak to a young man that the great Wilkerson of White Plains had sent down to juggle with the flora and fauna of the Harpeth Valley. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Heart's Kingdom. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kay Hand. The Heart's Kingdom by Maria Thompson Davies. Chapter 10. Water and Oil. I turned from Nickols's raillery and surveyed the great American garden. The weeks had flown from May to late July, and father's plans were beginning to be materialized. Where the sunken garden had been filled in a wide stone well house, the like of which can be found at many of the farmhouses in the Harpeth Valley, had been built, and a chain wheel and a bucket drew up the water from deep cisterns, which was supplied with underground pipes from the south wing of the Poplars. There is no water as soft as open-top cistern water, aerated by a chain and bucket, father had informed me, and he and Dabney consumed buckets of it, while Mammy refused anything else for cooking purposes and insisted on a nightly bath of it for my face. A white clematis in full bloom clambered over the eaves of the low stone house, and a blush rose nodded at its door, beside which was placed a rough bench made of square stones and 2 large slabs, equally moss-covered and worn. "It's growing to be perfectly wonderful, Nickols," I said, as if I had seen it for the first time, while my eyes followed the sweep of the flagstone walk from the well house beneath the old graybeard poplars out past stretches of velvety lawn, with groups of shrubs and trees casting deep shadows even to the kitchen garden, whose long rows of vegetables, bordered with old-fashioned blooming herbs and savories, led the observer out into the meadows to the home farm and beyond to the dim line of Paradise Ridge. "It is different and distinctive and American," I added. After this garden and the school are finished, and a few of the unfortunate restorations taken away from some of the old houses, like the porch at Mrs. Sproul's, and that bathroom addition to Morgan's, I am going to bring Jeffries down in his private car, and it will be difficult to keep him from offering to buy Goodlet's and have it all shipped up the Hudson. Really, Charlotte, we have seen a vision of the future materialize here, and we ought to stand with hats off." "Whose vision?" I asked, as I stood and let the truth of his statement sink in. "The parson's spiritual vision perhaps filtering through your father's mentality, which has welded past, present, and future. At least that is the way I see it with the material eye, which is all I have to view it with, if we can call the recognition of beauty and completeness material. Now Mikey is nice and clean, and we can go to minister to play. Thank you, Aunt Charlotte." At this point young Charlotte broke in to say, thus flinging us a line to haul us out of the depths that were slightly over our heads, "Isn't he lovely?" And she gazed upon her new-found comrade with open admiration and self-congratulation. And small Mikey was indeed a bonny kiddie, attired in the very stylish trousers and blouse of small James, and shining with Dabney's valeting. His nicely plastered red mop to some extent mitigated the effect of the bare and scratched feet, and his rollicking blue eyes over a nose as tip-tilted as Charlotte's own bespoke his delight. "Anyway, me mother made the togs for Jim," he asserted with great independence as he rammed his hands into the diminutive pockets in the trousers. "Yes, she did, and Aunt Harriet paid her for a present to Jimmy. She sews for us and not for Mikey and her other children, because her husband drinks up his money and our husband don't. Come on, let's go help minister," was the shot that Charlotte fired as she departed down the garden path with her cohorts. "What about that for democracy?" demanded Nickols, as he and father and I all laughed together. That night at a dinner party Nell was giving, I sat next to the Harpeth Jaguar and talked to him for the first time in many weeks. I had been avoiding him, and I didn't mind admitting it to myself. There was something disturbing and puzzling in his serene eyes and free, strong, beautiful body that gave me a queer haunting pain back of my breast. Into my scheme of doing those things in life that give pleasure and not doing those that give pain he somehow would not fit. He had become as much a part of the social fabric of Goodlet's as was I, and he came to our dinner parties, motored with us in his long gray car, and was as happy with us seemingly as he was with that same gray car full of small fry from the settlement or going about the business of the chapel. The car had always reminded me of his evening clothes, which were straight and simple in line with the black silk vest cut up around the collar buttoned in the back, but which were so fine in texture and perfect in cut and fit that they seemed to be some kind of superclothes that ought to be called by a name of their own, just as the people in the settlement had decided to call the car the Chariot as soon as they had stopped resenting a parson's having it, from finding out how easy were its cushions and how swift its ministrations in time of need. "Parson's chariot, quick!" had moaned poor old Mrs. Kelly when she had slipped on Mrs. Burns's wet doorstep and dislocated her hip. Little Katie Moore had been driven home as swiftly as if on wings after old Dr. Harding had been overtaken, 10 miles out on Providence Road, and had used the back seat for an operating table while he put her small splintered ankle in place between splints improvised by a long knife from the car's kit. And from a distance I had wondered at the Reverend Gregory Goodloe, wondered at his freedom from all resentment because of his ministerial and spiritual failures, and at his loving serenity and enjoyment of us all. He partook of the joy in almost all of our adventures and pleasure, and when we did things that in the nature of the case would seem to merit his disapproval, he never administered it. He simply was not with us, but was serenely about his business at the other end of the town from the country club or the Last Chance, at whichever resort the entertainment that did not interest him was in progress. He seemed especially to enjoy coming to our dinner parties, and he was such a delight with his keen-bladed wit, his flow of joyous laughter and high spirits, and the music that bubbled up without accompaniment or denial whenever we asked for it, that not a woman in town would invite the rest to dine until she was sure of securing him first. "He's so economical," said Nell Morgan as I helped her arrange her guests for Mark's birthday dinner. While she talked I paused to consider where to put Harriet Henderson, and then dropped her card beside Mark's with a little ache in my heart as I tucked Cliff Gray in by Jessie Litton and left the place next to Nell vacant for Billy. People never empty their champagne glasses when Mr. Goodloe gets to talking, and you can put the extra bottles back in the cellar for next time. Do you suppose he does it on purpose? Nobody could be as completely happy as he was at Jessie's Friday night on purpose, I answered, as I laid the last card and went with Nell to greet her first guests. After the soup I turned toward the Reverend Mr. Goodloe, whose card I had placed next to my own, and found him looking at me with a particular softness in his eyes under the dull gold. Charlotte's and Mikey's 9 won 28-18 against Tommy Brady and Maudie Burns. Thank you for getting the pitcher into his togs, he said, as he squared his shoulders slightly against the rest of the world, the rest of the diners in particular, and bent toward me in just that deferential angle that a man uses when he wants to signal to the others that for a limited time he desires sole possession of the woman dining next to him. Your mixing of water and oil in the educational scheme is interesting me greatly, I answered him with a laugh. Do you really think it will succeed? Any kind of kingdom can be built in the heart of a child, an oligarchy, a democracy, or a republic, he answered quickly. Your name daughter is a born socialist. She and James are murderers and liars and thieves and are wholly engaging. Sue is fast learning from them the habits of their underworld and is asleep upstairs now with Harriet's silver and jade chain, which she brought home with her without the knowledge of the owner this afternoon. What are you going to do about them? I take it you intend to build a kingdom in and of their hearts. Weed 'em, like Dabney and I did your Delia bank 10 times at least this spring. You didn't help with the dahlias, but maybe you will win with the young tenderloiners. His eyes entreated mine with a soft radiance that almost made me dizzy. I wouldn't know weeds from flowers, minister, I answered with a prompt denial of his plea, but with a soft use of the children's name for him. I don't always know. Let's study botany together, he again hazarded daringly, and from the tenderness that suddenly curved his strong mouth I knew my soft answer had hit its mark. Are you coming to the dedication of the chapel a week from Sunday? He asked me the question directly and with all his softness gone, and a commanding note in his voice and a direct look. His jeweled eyes were so deep back under their dull gold brows that between the bars of black lashes they looked like stars shining down through a radiant night. They threw their rays directly down into my heart, and I could see that their owner was reading the hieroglyphics of my uncertainties and that I could not hide them from him. I am not, I answered him with the frankness that his gaze compelled. I'll not dedicate it until you help me do it, and he was saying quietly and positively when Billy broke in over the excluding shoulder. Billy really adores Gregory Goodloe, but he enjoys going to the limit of his ministerial endurance. Over that limit he has never stepped, and he never will. None of them ever will, for there is that in the Harpeth Jaguar which commands the very essence of respect for himself as well as his cloth. Say, parson, what's that about the dedication of the chapel? He asked, as he twirled his champagne glass to break a few bubbles. Charlotte and Nickols are going to give Harriet and me that tennis dressing down Sunday week if you don't need us to dedicate with. No, I won't need you, answered the Reverend Mr. Goodloe in an easy, agreeable voice, but that had in it the note that he always uses to make Billy halt. I'm not going to dedicate it yet. Why? Came in a perfect chorus. I've been working day and night on that altar cloth because I depended on you to know the date of the dedication of your own church. I have danced only once this week, said Leticia Cockrell with her usual bland directness. The communion service from Gorham's has been packed away unopened in my office a week, Hampton added in an aggrieved voice. They hurried it for us, and it has to be sent back, piece at a time, to be marked. The baptismal font is perfectly beautiful, and I want the suckling sprinkled from it first. If you don't hurry, she will get old enough to misbehave herself. I know I promised, but I have decided that I can never have others baptized now. They are too bad, said Nell, as she paused and listened for some sort of explosion from above, as she did every minute or two. I'll rope Charlotte and drag her to the altar for you, and Mark can sit on her feet while the parson sprinkles, offered Billy, and they all laughed at the picture he conjured, which seemed to be in keeping with many scenes we had witnessed in the life of small Charlotte. That won't be necessary. She will stand before me with folded hands when her time comes, answered Mr. Goodloe, after he had laughed as heartily as anybody else at Billy's threat. The greatest difficulty will be in persuading her to allow me to conduct my own services. But what did you put off the dedication date for? Demanded Leticia, with the hurry over the altar cloth still rankling. I put off the dedication of the chapel until all of the people for whom I care deeply, whose cooperation with me is positively necessary, should be ready to come and help me in the services. When that time comes I will have the dedication. It may be a year and it may be a day, the parson answered with cool directness. If you mean Charlotte, the offer I made for young Charlotte holds good, said Billy with positive glee. If you want her, I'll rope her and drag her in, and the rest of you can bid for who holds her down while being branded. And my answer to your generous offer, Billy Harvey, is, Mr. Goodloe paused and looked at me, and Jessie giggled with nervousness, the same that I made to your offer about the constraining of young Charlotte. Still it would be great sport to see both the Charlottes, Billy was saying, when a servant brought a note on his tray, handed it to Mr. Goodloe, who glanced at it and then hurriedly opened and read it. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morgan, but will you let me answer this summons?" he asked, and there was the regret in his rich voice of a great boy at being snatched from a feast. "I am so hungry," he added with a laugh. "Come back later. I'll save some of everything for you," said Nell pleadingly. "I will if I can," he answered. There was an excited smolder in the stars under the dull gold that made me restless, and my eyes sought and claimed his for a second, in which a quick flash of the jeweled tenderness of comprehension was flashed into my depths. "Good bye, everybody," he said, and in a second was out of the dining room, and we could hear him running down the steps. "Oh dear, if he just wasn't a preacher," sighed Harriet. "I suppose somebody in the Settlement is dead or borned or drunk, and he has to go see about it. I wish—" "Great Jehovah!" exclaimed Billy, as he suddenly jumped to his feet. "Ensley is fighting drunk and has the gang all round the Last Chance. Parson's life isn't worth a tinker's damn if he runs foul of them with all that talk about Martha Ensley and Jacob's threat. She came back last night and Goodloe threatened to have Jacob arrested for beating her. Come on, Nickols, let's follow him. We'll be enough. The rest of you go on eating and drinking and marrying because old Mark was born. We'll come right back just as soon as we see that all is serene on the Potomac of the Last Chance." And with a last hasty gulp at his wineglass Billy followed Nickols out of the room. Nickols was both white and livid, and the expression of his face frightened me, for I knew that Billy would minimize any kind of danger in the presence of a woman, while Nickols would not take that trouble. It was with a queer breathlessness that we all sat before our wineglasses in the midst of the perfume from the rich food and dying flowers and waited. For what, we did not know. Then it came. A shot rang out clear and clean in the darkness and was quickly followed by 3 barking echoes from a repeater. And there, seated in my chair in the brilliantly lighted room, blocks away from the scene, I felt a bullet thud against dull gold. End of chapter 10.